is in your life's blueprint. This is the most important and crucial period of your lives, for what you do now and what you decide now at this age may well determine which way your life shall go. And whenever a building is constructed, you usually have an architect who draws a blueprint. And that blueprint serves as the pattern, as the guide, as the model for those who are to build the building. And a building is not well erected without a good, sound, and solid blueprint. And I want to suggest some of the things that should be in your life's blueprint. Number one in your life's blueprint should be a deep belief in your own dignity, your own worth, and your own somebodyness. Don't allow anybody to make you feel that you are nobody. Always feel that you count. Always feel that you have worth. And always feel that your life has ultimate significance. Secondly, in your life's blueprint, you must have, as a basic principle, the determination to achieve excellence in your various fields of endeavor. You're going to be deciding as the days and the years unfold what you will do in life, what your life's work will be. And once you discover what it will be, set out to do it and to do it well. And I say to you, my young friends, that doors are opening to each of you. Doors of opportunity are opening to each of you that were not open to your mothers and to your fathers. And the great challenge facing you is to be ready to enter these doors as they open. And so I would urge you to study hard, to burn the midnight oil. I would say to you, don't drop out of school, and I understand all of the sociological reasons why we often drop out of school. But I urge you, in spite of your economic plight, in spite of the situation that you are forced to live so often with intolerable conditions, stay in school. And when you discover what you're going to be in life, set out to do it as if God Almighty called you at this particular moment in history to do it. Set out to do a good job and do that job so well that the living, the dead, or the unborn couldn't do it any better. If you can't be a pine on the top of the hill, be a scrub in the valley. But be the best little scrub on the side of the rill. Be a bush if you can't be a tree. If you can't be a highway, just be a trail. If you can't be the sun, be a star. For it isn't by size that you win or you fail. Be the best of whatever you are. Finally, in your life's blueprint must be a commitment to the eternal principles of beauty, love, and justice. Don't allow anybody to pull you so low as to make you hate them. Don't allow anybody to cause you to lose your self-respect to the point that you do not struggle for justice. However young you are, you have a responsibility to seek to make your nation a better nation in which to live. You have a responsibility to seek to make life better for everybody. And so you must be involved in the struggle for freedom and justice. Now, in this struggle for freedom and justice, there are many constructive things that we all can do and that we all must do. And so our slogan must not be burn, baby, burn. It must be build, baby, build. Organize, baby, organize. Yes, our slogan must be learn, baby, learn, so that we can earn, baby, earn. And with a powerful commitment, I believe that we can transform dark yesterdays of injustice into bright tomorrows of justice and humanity. Let us keep going toward the goal of selfhood, toward the realization of the dream of brotherhood, and toward the realization of the dream of understanding goodwill. Let nobody stop us, but we must keep moving. We must keep going. If you can't fly, run. If you can't run, walk. If you can't walk, crawl, but by all means, keep moving.
Welcome to our virtual town hall event, Black Love Matters, Authentic Men's Voices on Marriage and Romantic Relationships. I'm Armon Perry, professor at the University of Louisville, where I teach there in the School of Social Work, and I study fathers' involvement with their children, as well as Black men and their contributions to family functioning. We're here today to talk about a really, really important topic, which is the role that Black men play in shaping their marriages and romantic relationships. These are topics that get a lot of discussion in the culture, in the community, and really have gotten a lot of discussion in the academic research. But oftentimes it's the case that these conversations are deficit framed and negatively focused, and to whatever extent Black men get discussed, it's usually in implicating them in the challenges and barriers facing their families. And so we wanted to broaden the conversation out today, and so that's what we're here to do. And again, centering that conversation on the role that men play in their marriage and romantic relationships. In order to do that, we want to provide you with some data on Black marriages, talk a little bit about what the numbers say in terms of the state of Black marriages. Let's talk a little bit about the book, although, again, the conversation is broader than the book, but we want to center the book and talk a little bit about what inspired the book and also some of the background in the book. Then we'll have an opportunity to hear from some of the contributors to the book. Um, I had the privilege of being joined by three amazing scholars who helped me with specific chapters in the book, lending their experience and expertise, and I think they were the perfect touches and perfect additions to making the book what it is. After that, we'll have an opportunity to engage a panel discussion with three practitioners, three men who are out in the field doing really, really amazing work as it relates to keeping these conversations going in and around their fields of practice, whether it be relationship coaching, whether it be podcasts, whether it be authors, or whatever the case may be. And then we'll wrap the day up with a brief summary, talk a little bit about what have we learned today, and then what is it that we need to do going forward. So as we get into some of the data on Black men and marriages, the data tell us that marriage rates for Black people have declined from around 60% of Black adults in 1970 being married to approximately 30% of Black adults being married in a contemporary society. And so although we know that marriage rates have declined for all Americans, we see those numbers sort of exponentially declining when it comes to Black adults. We also know that when Black people do get married, they're more likely to divorce than their white counterparts, and they're less likely to remarry than their white counterparts. The data also tell us that Black men and women report lower expectations of marriage than their white counterparts. And unfortunately, Black women report lower marriage and relationship satisfaction than white men, white women, as well as Black men. So again, so we see the data tell us that there's a lot of challenges, a lot of barriers, a lot of work to be done as it relates to improving the health of Black marriage in our community. So these are things that are on my mind because they necessarily influence and impact the work that I do around not only fatherhood, but again, Black men's contributions to families. My sense is these are conversations that you all are having in your communities, in your families, in your neighborhood, and this is something that influences and impacts the culture as a whole. And so again, we want to use this time, use this platform to engage in some really, really deep and meaningful conversations so that we can do our part to help move things forward in this way. When we think about the book that I just wrote, Black Love Matters, you can find it on Lexington Books. It's an imprint of Roman and Littlefield if you're out there interested in getting a copy of it. But just to give you a brief preview and set the stage for what happens in the book, the book was largely inspired by, again, some of the data that I just shared with you, and knowing and seeing that there's a lot of challenges facing Black families, a lot of challenges facing Black marriages, and all too often, whether it be in the academic research or even in pop culture, Black men end up being implicated in discussions about what is facing their families in a negative sense, but it's rare that we get firsthand accounts from what Black men think or what their experiences have been in those marriages and romantic relationships. So I set out to try to balance out that discussion by engaging what I would call authentic Black men, everyday sort of common Black men in discussions and conversations about the ups and downs, the ebbs and flows of their relationships and their marriages, those who were married. And so what we did was we were able to recruit a group of about 33 Black men who were diverse in terms of age. They ranged from 18 to 72 years old. They were diverse in terms of their income. We had guys who were unemployed all the way up to guys earning up to $175,000 a year. They were diverse in terms of educational attainment. Most of the guys had at least a high school diploma. About 40% had a college degree, and there were a few who had graduate degrees and professional degrees, and then there were a handful for any number of reasons didn't report their educational attainment. The guys were also diverse in terms of their relationship status. 42% of the guys were married, 27% had never been married, 21% were divorced, and 9% were remarried. And so we followed the guys for a period of 4 years, again, tracing the ups and downs and the trajectories in their relationships so that we could not only get a snapshot of what their relationships like at any point in time, but also seeing how things changed over time and what were the circumstances that necessarily shaped those changes. And we bring those to you in Black Love Matters. In terms of the layout of the book, what you're looking at now is sort of a copy of the table of contents. There's 7 chapters in the book. The first one is what we call From Act Like a Lady, Think Like a Man to 444. And basically what we're doing here is we're situating the book at the intersection between academic research and popular culture. And so we take the period of time between 2008 and 2018, which is about a 10-year span where we looked at the pop culture influences on Black relationships, starting with Steve Harvey's Act Like a Lady, Think Like a Man, and sort of bookending that with Jay-Z's 444 album. And with the help of Dr. Siobhan Smith, who you'll hear from later, we make the case that this is in many ways a golden era of sort of popular culture where it's becoming more and more okay for Black men to be emotionally expressive and vulnerable with their emotions and their feelings. And as you'll hear throughout the rest of the day, that I think these are things that many of the professionals who work in this arena would argue is a really good thing and is a sign of not only strength in terms of the new generation, but it's also something that gives us reason to be encouraged about where things may be able to go in terms of getting some of those negative data turned around. The second chapter we call Setting the Stage, and this is just sort of a chapter on the methodology of the study where I lay out some of the statistics and some of the data that I just provided for you. We also talk about how it was we set up the interviews, how often we interviewed the guys. We talked about the major themes that emerged in the book. We also take some time to do an examination of the setting for the study, which is the city of Louisville, Kentucky, which I think in a lot of ways is an interesting sort of a place to have a conversation around Black love and Black relationships, given some of the ways in which Louisville is situated within a broader sense of the state of Kentucky, within a broader region of the Southeast, and also within its own sort of historical place here in the United States. And so we make the case that Louisville is an ideal place to have some of these discussions. The third chapter, we call it Let's Talk About Sex, and that's written with Dr. Cherie Langley. And in that book, in that chapter, what we talk about is the men's discussion and conversation about the role that sex plays in shaping their relationships. We also get into a discussion of one of the more interesting findings in the book, which is the idea that many of the men were open about the idea that they were interested in achieving intimacy with their partners, whether it had anything to do with sex or not, which was something that I was not expecting going into the book. So we lay out those discussions in that chapter. Chapter 4, we call Trials, Tribulations, and Trauma. This is with Dr. Azaliah Israel. And in this chapter, again, this was another sort of a surprise in terms of the things that emerged. The guys were really, really open about some of the challenges that they faced, some of what we would call traumas that they had experienced, and some of the ways in which those things necessarily shaped some of their relationships, not only at the time when they happened, but into the future. And so we're in a place and we're in a space where people are talking a lot more about mental health, and I think that's a good thing. We're trying to bring mental health into the mainstream of medicine, make discussions and conversations around mental health and mental illness more mainstream, and particularly more mainstream even in the Black community, as we remove some of the stigma and we remove some of the taboo. And so to the extent that the guys were open and willing to talk to me about their traumas and the way in which they impacted their relationships, we think that was a good thing, and we wanted to share those stories with you through this particular chapter. Chapter 5 is what we call A Change Gonna Come. And there, again, as I mentioned, we interviewed the guys several times over a period of 4 years. And in this chapter, we trace the trajectories, the ups and downs, the ebbs and the flows, the transitions in their relationships, as some of the guys went from being single to being married, and some went from being married to being separated, and some went from having no partner at all to married, and some went from any other number of sort of relationship transitions. And then there were also some guys whose relationship stayed stable over the entire 4-year study period. And so in either of those situations, not only did we discuss the guys' relationship trajectory over time, but we also talked about what the guys thought were the reasons for either their relationship stability or whatever changes that happened in them. Chapter 6 is called Love and Manhood. And in this chapter, we deal with the issue of masculinity. And specifically, we wrestle with, to what extent did the men feel like being involved in a romantic relationship shape their thoughts and their concepts of manhood, particularly in the context of Black manhood. So we get into some identity discussions and conversations that I think are really, really important for us to have in that chapter. And then in the last chapter, reflections and recaps, we just go over some of the major conclusions of the book. We talk about what do we think the conclusions mean from a research standpoint, from a practitioner standpoint, from a clinical standpoint. And then the men offer up advice to anyone who they feel like may be interested in Black love and relationships. So again, so you have an opportunity to hear directly from the men so as to balance out that all too consistent narrative of folks talking about Black men, but rarely, if ever, talking to Black men. So again, one of the things we wanted to center in this book is to talk directly to the men so that their stories and their narratives could take center stage and you can hear directly from them. And so we do that in each of these chapters, but we particularly place emphasis on it in that last chapter, reflections and recaps.
What's more dangerous? A man who isn't afraid of death or one who's found everything to live for? I asked him if he was proud of me. He emphatically said yes as he laid his pecan-colored head on my chest, and I went through my mind 1,000 times to figure out what that could possibly mean, and every single example ended in motivation for me. So you may not be afraid to die, but I'm more afraid to let them down. And I found something to live for, which is a dangerous motive forever fueled. See, your thoughts may be involuntary, but my actions are very calculated. I was a man with a plan, but now I'm a dad with a decree, and you can't take that from me. My sons ain't raised by no coward, and they won't be one either. If this be the measure of a man, the yardstick gonna need way more meters. I take it too far, so they never come up short, because I found everything to live for.
Reaching out today to talk a little bit about our project with Black Love Matters and the chapter that you contributed to. For those of you all who are listening, we're joined today with Savon Smith, Dr. Savon Smith from the University of Louisville in the Department of Communications. Savon, talk to us a little bit about who you are and talk to us a little bit about your background, and then we'll jump right into it after that.
Sure. My name is Siobhan Smith-Jones. I was born and raised in Pine Bluff, Arkansas. I attended Xavier University of Louisiana, so the only Catholic HBCU actually in the country, so down in New Orleans. And even though Southern Louisiana was kind of dirty and stinky, I liked it there. So I went to LSU. And so I focused on mass communication in both places and thought that I wanted to go into, entertainment news like but luckily, it didn't feel like luckily at the time for me, but there were actually no entry-level jobs in that. And so at first my father said, well, just come back home. And I cried about that because I did not want to come back home. Pine Bluff is kind of like one of those places where if you don't know the person, you know somebody who knows them. So I was not trying to do that. And so then he said, well, why don't you come home and teach? And I really cried about that because that had never been on my life's agenda. But as I recall, I graduated from LSU on like August the 5th. And then I started teaching at the University of Arkansas at Pine Bluff, which is an HBCU there in my hometown. And I taught there for 2 years. And as corny as it might sound, I really did fall in love with college teaching. And so I decided to go back and to school. And so I went back and did my PhD at the University of Missouri in Columbia. And then I have been here at the University of Louisville since 2010. And so I focus on, I'm in the communication department, media studies. And so generally if I'm working just, on my own devices, then I tend to look at race and gender portrayals in the media. And so, frankly, I love trashy reality TV. So that's one of the places that I like to look. And so I've done some really fun studies, for example, looking at race and gender portrayals in I Love New York, Tila Tequila. I've looked at Black fatherhood in T.I. and Tiny, The Family Hustle. I've had a chance to do some Black masculinity studies with this character. I don't know if you know him, Armon Perry and Derek Brooms, and we have a great piece titled, You Ain't No Denzel. And so we had a great time with that. And so now some of my latest work is looking at the impact, so like audience reception studies. So one that I've done is looked at the impact that Black Panther had on Black women and the idea of anticipatory vigilance. So the idea that they are looking forward to seeing what our media are going to give us with regard to representation.
Oh,
so
wow.
That's a little bit about me.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. So I just wanted to point it out just real quick that you talked about being from Pine Bluff and teaching at Pine Bluff. Did I ever tell you my undergrad is at Alabama State, so we have a SWAC connection there.
Oh yeah, I don't think I knew that.
Yeah, I did my undergraduate work at Alabama State. So yes,
See, I know bitterly about your connections to, Rolling Tides.
Yeah, well, yeah. So I did all my grad work at the, and of course we just pulled off another national championship. So we wanted to welcome everybody else. So thank everybody else for coming out to participate in the University of Alabama National Invitational Tournament, otherwise known as a college football season.
Okay.
Yeah. So before we jump into the questions, do you remember how we met?
I think we met at the Black Family Conference.
We did. Shout out to
Dr.
Joseph McMillan. Yeah, the late great.
Yeah, see, by the time I started going to it, he had actually passed. So I want to say it might have been 2011, 2012.
Yeah, it was around that time. And do you remember the specific circumstances, though?
You're going to laugh at me. All I can really remember is that you had your son on your shoulders.
Right. Well, it was even before that, though. So it
was before that. Okay.
We met at the registration table. I think you were in line behind me at the registration, and whoever the woman was who was sort of checking names, she was giving us the hardest time about trying to get us to switch our presentations from PowerPoint to Prezi, and she was going.
I do remember that.
He was going on.
I had forgotten about that. Yes.
Yeah, on and on about Prezi. If I didn't know any better, you would think she had stock in Prezi, the way she was pushing that on us. And so anyway, we had a chuckle about that, struck up a conversation. And I think later on in the conference, whomever the guest speaker was, I don't know if it was Cornel West or Michael Eric Dyson or whoever it was, but I wasn't going to miss it. And so I ended up bringing my infant son to hang out at the conference. So anyway, so we've been, as you mentioned, we've known each other for almost a decade now, right?
And I know, it's crazy. Here, say 10 years worth of cutting up with you.
Right. Yeah, the way time flies.
Indeed.
It certainly flies when you're having fun. And you talked about some of the collaborations over the years, and I have always appreciated the perspective that you bring to the work and your collaborative spirit, and just being just a good soul and a good person to hang out with and do work with. So when I was putting this book project together, you were one of the first people I thought about in terms of being a contributor and collaborator. So I appreciate you lending your expertise and your experience to the project. The first question is, tell us a little bit about your thoughts on how it is that the media frames Black loves and Black families.
So I think that the media has a really interesting way of portraying Black love and Black families, and frankly to a way that it's, I would say, more towards the negative. I think we're doing better now and seeing more positive portrayals, more positive images and representations. But for example, one of the interesting conversations that I had when I was doing my work on Black Panther, and different people were talking about the portrayal of the Black family in that film. But one of my interviewees was saying that when she looked back on it, she realized that Black love, and so we're the same age, born in 80, that Black love, Black relationships were often kind of plagued with like strife and struggle and difficulty. And it didn't seem to really be loving, kind, generous, the things that you would hope to see when you see love, or frankly, just even seeing the images. And so I promised you I was going to do kind of like an informal little study. And so I've been kind of just paying attention. And so we have to get, to see it. But it actually might be something, worth pursuing, publishing, wise. But what I've noticed is that even if you just think about like in advertising, currently you don't see a lot of Black couples. And on one hand, I think this is a good thing because we're getting to see a different range of families and getting to really see families that look like the way we look in the world today, right? But at the same time, what does it mean if you don't see, or you so very rarely see, a Black couple together? And what does that mean for, so again, in terms of that representation, because again, our media are so powerful and they do influence us, you know, so it might not be that you walk away thinking, well, oh, Black love isn't important, you know, Black relationships, they don't matter. But if you don't even see them, the idea or the concept of non-recognition, that also tells us or gives us messages about Black love and Black relationships.
That's interesting. So my follow-up was going to be to ask you to talk about the impact on romantic relationships based on what it was you were just saying. I think in a lot of ways you sort of touched on that and alluded to it, but you mentioned the word, what was that you said?
Non-recognition?
Yeah, talk to us a little bit more about
Okay.
that. That may be a new
Sure.
term for many of us, including.
Sure. So Clark, who is a media scholar, actually goes through and talks about the different phases of recognition in the media. And his kind of theoretical concept is actually based in queer representation.
Okay.
But he says that at first you go through a period of non-recognition. So whatever group that you're talking about, you just literally don't see them. And so, of course, then that sends you a message, right, that this group doesn't exist. Since you don't see them, they're missing. They're not part of like society or part of our culture milieu. So, okay, so they don't even exist. The second phase, as I recall, is, I think it's ridicule.
Okay.
So that is when they appear, but they're now kind of like the butt of the joke. So they're there just for, you know, for you to laugh at, just, you know, comic relief, giggles. You're not really seeing them as fully part of, again, the actual society. They're still othered, right? They're still not really in. The third phase, I think, is regulation. And that's when on the continuum, they become to be accepted a little bit more. And that is because they are seen as like members of like law and order. So that's when you'll see people, you know, as detectives, cops, you know, those in authority. And then it becomes like full recognition. So finally, when you are actually part of the whole.
Gotcha.
And so I think what's happening right now, and again, I can kind of understand the tug both ways, you know, culturally, but I think we're really not seeing, you know, too many Black couples, you know, like I said, especially in advertising. But if you think of in our other, you know, media offerings, so, you know, I love trash reality TV. And of course, again, you have to take it with a grain of salt, right? I think that most people, again, would say, yeah, I know that it's not real. But at the same time, the moniker is reality TV. But again, what does it mean if so much of the storyline, so much of the narrative, and granted, they have to have something to do because otherwise we wouldn't watch it. But what happens when the majority of those programs, the concept is that these Black couples are having problems in their relationships, you know? And again, it doesn't seem, because of course, no relationship is perfect. Every relationship has its issues. But what if you never see them ever working together? You never see them trying to work towards common goals. You know, or if we think about it, even like Basketball Wives, right? When you think about it, that the majority of the cast for most of the seasons actually weren't wives.
Right.
It could have been, you know, Shawnee O'Neal, you know, she could have cast Basketball Wives, but for the most part, she didn't. So again, just kind of the portrayal, like I said, if you just, you know, kind of look around and start thinking about the different places, if you do see relationships that they are usually, unfortunately, not positive, happy things, but something to struggle with and to have strife in.
Yeah, that's interesting. And so to the extent that many of us view or see TV or film or whatever as a reflection of whatever it is we think is reality, right? I think to the point that you were making, if you turn on the TV or go to the movies, you walk away with the impression that there is no Black happiness in the context of love. It's all sort of like you say, a fight and stress and strain. So that's interesting that's the way that plays out. And again, as you mentioned, when in our piece on You Ain't No Denzel, we know that people are using media to sort of narrate their own lives. And so it makes you wonder about just how much of an influence and impact it's having, because we know that people are absorbing these images and receiving these things and internalizing them. And to see that we're being portrayed in that sort of a way and knowing the potential impact is disheartening, I think, in a lot of ways.
So even if, go ahead, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
So what I was thinking again, kind of like it, two different places. So for example, kind of like some classic studies. So for example, on like the Cosby Show. And the Cosby Show was kind of a double-edged sword, because on one hand, Black people, white people, everyone saw the Cosby Show and could see here is a well-to-do middle-class family. You have the father husband who's a doctor, the wife mother who was a lawyer. They have 5 beautiful children. They have a comfortable home. This is great. So on one hand, it was very uplifting for people because, of course, they had the HBCU connection. Mm-hmm. They had jazz there in the home, art, all of these different things that spoke to Black culture. But then on the other hand, so for many Black people, it was, well, I can never be the Huxtables. So all this does is upset me because this is something that I can never achieve. And then for many white audience members, they were saying, well, the Cosbys aren't really Black. I don't really see them as Black because of their socioeconomic status. I really don't see them as Black people. But again, and like you said, remember when we were doing the study that, many of the Black men actually talked about the Cosby Show and how in many ways that was something that they were upholding. Sure. But then like when you were talking about just the idea that people do kind of consciously or unconsciously actually do use these different media as models for themselves. So I'm going to bring up one of your favorite books and movies. So, Act Like a Lady, Think Like a Man.
Oh my God.
I know it's your favorite thing to talk about.
Yeah.
But it's interesting because, right, like it's a self-help book, and that becomes a movie, which is kind of the same thing that happened with like, He's Just Not That Into You, and they somehow made it into a romantic comedy, but okay. But what's interesting about it is that Steve Harvey, which his advice, and again, it's really interesting because, he's not someone from a, psychological background or, social work and, but right. Okay, but he has a platform.
Sure.
But his platform, and especially in the movie, does not really involve the couple sitting down and working their way through things together. It's kind of, okay, ladies, here are these tricks that you need to play. Right. You need to think like a man. You need to get in and basically play this game, as opposed to why can't we sit down, and if we really do want to be in a relationship together, why can't we sit down and work together and figure out how to communicate?
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And so this is a whole sort of semester's worth of content in 20, 30 minutes right here. Right.
Super masterclass.
Absolutely. And so for everyone who is viewing, you could thank me later for bringing this lecture and this seminar to you. And I think in a lot of ways, that's a nice segue, because in a lot of ways, what you're doing for us is you're sort of breaking down these media, and one of the things that we've talked about over the time is just this idea of media literacy. So from a person who is an expert in this, why is media literacy important in socializing our young people, particularly around this issue of romantic relationships?
So I think it's twofold. So first, with regard to media literacy in general, media literacy is as important as literacy. So being able to sit down and read and interpret, a written text, that's what we have to be able to do with all of our various media. And so that's being able to comprehend more than just what the words are, more than just what the images are, but what do these things really mean and what are the messages that they send us? And so that's the first thing about media literacy, because again, the media are so powerful, so impactful that you need to always have kind of like a critical viewpoint or critical perspective and not just, eat it up. And again, I think that most people probably in the back of their minds are critical, but that's work. So most of the time, when you sit down to watch a movie, you're not sitting down, watching, Think Like a Man with all of these thoughts in your head. No, you just want to go in and enjoy the movie. But you do need to have, like I said, this kind of critical perspective. Again, I think the reason why it's so important with regard to socialization. So, for example, when I thought back on it, just of course, in general, one of the most important socialization agents in my life was my father. Mm-hmm. But I kind of remember, so different things, not even related to media, I really learned, frankly, about relationships with him and from him. So, for example, I remember him telling me growing up, and I remember being very young and him telling me, well, you're very smart, you're very talented, and kind of like you don't have to settle, and go and get your schooling. So, for example, he would always tell me, well, go to school, get your degree. Your mother went, she has her degree. So, frankly, if something happens to me, she doesn't need me. She's good. Mm-hmm. So just kind of like instilling that almost, on one hand, you don't need a man, or take care of yourself, see to yourself first, which actually was quite frankly helpful, because I don't think men get the message the same way, but young women, basically from the time they're about 18 on, it's kind of like, where's your husband? Where's your husband? Where's your husband? Have you found him? Where is he? Or oh, you're getting your BA or whatever letter it is. Sure. Get your MRS too. And so he was always, from an early age said, don't focus on that. Mm-hmm. But also I remember him telling me, and I think I was really little, maybe 6 or 7, like, again, you don't have to kind of like, frankly, run behind or wait on any man. Mm-hmm. And I remember him telling me one time, like, you're very talented, like, you don't have to be a secretary. And that's not to say anything disparaging against secretaries. Sure. But he was saying, you can do for you. Mm-hmm. And so I remember actually being at home in Pine Bluff and seeing like a family friend, and he's a dentist and we hadn't seen him in a long time. And we were talking long, and it was me and one of my other girlfriends. And he goes, oh yeah, well, I would love to have y'all come into my office and be my secretaries. And I was like, I'm not going to be your secretary. Right. I'll be your office manager, but not your, and it was out of my mouth so quick. Mm-hmm. Before I even thought about it, it was out. But that was because that was something that was literally instilled into me when I was so young, or even, again, different messages that you get about how to interact. So, the whole, whoever you went to the party with, that's who you come back with. Mm-hmm. That was from my father. Mm. Or, if you go, you have a drink, you get your own drink. If you put the drink down, that drink no longer exists. So right. Those types of things were actually from my father. But again, I remember being very, very little with him, and again, not old enough, not in junior high. So maybe like later elementary. So maybe 9, 10, 11, something like that. And I can't remember what we were watching. But, again, just some of those ideas in our society is, for example, that young men are always supposed to be trying to pursue sex. And women or young women, girls are always supposed to be like the keepers of sex, or we're supposed to maintain pure. And so I can't remember what we were watching, but he said, well, if the idea that what makes a man is however many people he can sleep with, and if what makes a woman is how, virginal she remains, then who's having sex? Right. And yeah. Ding, I'd never thought about that. Because there was never any, there was nothing else really there to challenge that. So again, if you just get these media messages, that's what you think. So to go back to your original question, but that's why I think it's so important to have media literacy and really to have your parents there to do it, or an adult, like I said, in the case. And I do think it's, really interesting going back to, your area of study, Black masculinity, because I think a lot of times, again, the thought is like, oh, girls need their mothers, boys need their fathers, but it's that really children need both parents, right? To help them navigate the craziness of this world. And so, like I said, I give him, so much of that credit, for just, and like I said, I just remember those moments like that really, in different ways kind of steered my thinking. And I think many ways kind of laid down the future in terms of what I study.
Yeah, it sounds like it. Yeah, shout out to Pops, right? Yeah,
Yes, absolutely.
cool. What are you seeing, right? So in terms of like recent trends in media, what are some of the things that people should be on the lookout for? Not necessarily in a negative or positive way, but what are some of the larger sort of media trends around love and relationships? Again, as people now have an orientation to this idea of media literacy, now that they have those sort of skill sets, so they'll be working to sharpen their skill sets in those areas. Where can they apply those things in terms of what you're seeing in the contemporary content?
So I think what we're going to be seeing, and it's already happening, is we're now in the era of the subscription service, right?
Okay, right.
So
Like,
there's
share, and
now,
subscribe, right?
huh?
Like, share, and subscribe. That's everybody's.
Oh, exactly. So, Disney Plus, Discovery Plus, everyone is getting in on the subscription service. And of course, we still have our traditional media. So you have your, ABC, NBC, CBS, Fox, the CW. So you're like your traditional broadcast. You have all your cable, and like I said, now your subscription services, YouTube, etc. So I think what we're getting now again is a range of media offerings, and we're also now moving into a more progressive area in terms of our politics, I think in terms of our thoughts, and I think just in terms of what people are willing and open to. And so therefore, I think we're actually going to see, I hope, that we're actually going to see a more range of portrayal. So more range of Black experience. So for example, I think that we're going to see more intersections of various identities and different backgrounds being presented. So again, they are now going to be a part of the conversation as opposed to just being ignored. I think that we are getting the opportunities to see more portrayals, for example, of members of the queer community, right? Or just giving us more experiences that we have not seen or that have only been seen in a very stereotypical way, right? So I think that then opens up the door, because now again, you have all these different offerings also to see things from, different countries. Now you can get media that way. You're getting to see offerings from more than just a handful of, producers, creatives, etc. So I think that we are moving into an era where we're just going to see more representations and, Lord willing, more positive representations of Black love and Black relationships.
Awesome. Well, again, so we're almost out of time. But before we
Oh
go,
my goodness! So here said we cut up that much, and it's almost over. Oh
right,
wow!
yeah. 30 minutes flies by, and so does 10
Wow.
years, right? Um, so before we go, I want to open it up to you and give you an opportunity to share any final thoughts that you have, or any sort of take home messages that people should walk away from this sit down, this quick 30 minutes with,
Yeah.
that I've not for whatever reason asked about.
Sure. So, well, first I have this here beside me, this fun little ditty. So I just want to
Right.
show that. And so, look, shameless plug on my brother's
Thanks. Look,
behalf.
yeah. Well, look, watch this. We can go.
Yes, a
Double,
matching set. Yes,
yeah.
add this to your collection.
Go get three
Um,
copies, right? Yeah.
yes, but all jokes aside, I really do appreciate the work that you do. And because frankly, for example, in communication, a lot of times the only times that we get to hear about Black men and their experiences, frankly, is from a pathological standpoint. So even oftentimes when Black men are even a part of a research study, they might be a part of a prison population or a different population that, again, we're seeing in not a negative light. So I just appreciate that your work gives us insight into Black men. And frankly, as a Black woman, I have a father, I have a husband, Lord willing, one day I'll have a son, I have cousins. And again, instead of us playing these, games, let's try to figure out how we can communicate and learn from and understand each other. So I appreciate your work from that perspective. And so again, I think just the importance of media literacy in general. And so I would say that just kind of starts by asking yourself just some basic questions. And so 3 that I challenge my students with in my television criticism and African Americans in the media course is, when we're thinking about representations, think about of, by, and for. of bind for. So who are these images? Who are they of? Who's being portrayed?
Okay.
Who are they by? So who's behind it? So who are the creative forces, or what's the network? So, and then who is the actual target audience? So who is this supposed to be geared toward? And I think a lot of times, even if you just start with that, so if you're watching, program X, who is this supposed to be for? What are the assumptions about this audience? What do they think that this audience is interested in? And frankly, if you are being featured in this program, be honest with yourself. Do you like what you see? How is it representing you? Are there parts of the story that you don't see at all? And then, of course, I would love for everyone, all the young people in the future, to go into communication. But for those who do, then if your story is not there, then what do you have to add to the conversation, and how can you add it to the conversation? And how can you also encourage those around you to be critical of their media as well?
Awesome. Well, Doc, that was a full semester right there. And I really appreciate you saying the kind words about the work. Obviously, I feel the same way about you. And on this particular project, I literally couldn't have done it without you. So shout out to you as well. We appreciate you taking the time to come in and share with us all of your expertise and your experience. As we wrap up, again, I just wanted to let you know that we're super, super appreciative of the time, effort, and energy you put into the project. I'm certain that people listening at home have sort of increased their media literacy, and they've been in a position to really sharpen their skills and sharpen their knowledge base. So we really appreciate you taking the time to share with us. We will be in touch soon. And
yes, sir.
Once again, folks, that is Dr. Siobhan Smith at the University of Louisville in the Department of Communication. Doc, we appreciate you for coming out.
Thank you.
The thing that drives me every day as a dad is him. His real name is Darion, and we call him Day for short. Every day he's hungry for something, whether it's affection, attention, knowledge. And there's this huge responsibility in making sure that when he's no longer under my wing, that he's a good person. I think the advice I would give is you don't need to know all the answers. The craziest thing was believing that your dad knew everything. So as a dad, you felt like you had to know everything. You had to get everything right. It's okay to make mistakes. Just do it from the right place. As long as it's coming from love, then, it kind of starts to work itself out. I want him to be able to sit back one day and go, we worked together, we did a good job. I'll say my kid's pretty dope.
This is my daddy's book, Daddy, There's a Noise Outside. This book teaches you about protesting. You can buy this book at www.fathersincorporated.com.
Hello. Did you know that only 39% of all working dads believe they're doing a great job at being a father? Part of it has to do with how they feel about providing for their family. Well, today is a great day to take the first step into your dreams. We have a great program called Next Level Fatherhood. The curriculum is a 10-module course designed to develop practical and comprehensive fatherhood skills. In addition, we also provide support with child support, legitimation, expungement, co-parenting, and relationship skills. If you want to learn more about our Next Level Fatherhood services, visit www.fathersincorporated.com or call 770-804-9800. Thank you.
Hey, Sheree, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Good, good. Thank you for joining us. For everyone listening, this is Dr. Sheree Langley. Dr. Sheree Langley works at the University of Louisville and is also a contributor to the book Black Love Matters. Sheree, what we've been doing is we've been talking to all of the contributors, and then we also have a panel discussion with some other folks later on, just talking about topics related to all things Black love. And so we know that you have an extensive background in the areas of adolescent sexual health and a couple of other areas. If you would, talk to us a little bit about your background and some of your experience.
I am an epidemiologist by trade. So I have a master's of public health in epidemiology and international health from the University of Alabama at Birmingham. And I'm also have a PhD in health behavior from the University of Alabama at Birmingham with a joint program with the University of Alabama. I know that's your alma mater. So, most of my work has been with infectious disease in relation to my epidemiological work, which led me into my adolescent health work, which I normally focus on HIV/AIDS, and STIs, and sexual risk behaviors.
Okay.
Yeah. So from there, I've gotten more involved in the families that love them as well. So a lot of my work is surrounding adolescent risk behavior and the family context in which they're growing up.
Okay. So cool. So when you think about sort of the totality of your experience, what is, and I know that your dissertation revolved around the sort of the debut or the sort of introduction of adolescents and engaging or not engaging in sexual behavior. Could you say a word or two about some of that work?
Yeah, so my dissertation basically looked at family factors.
Mm-hmm.
And how those mediated the relationship between paternal absence, or if you want to look at it from paternal presence, and adolescent risk behavior, sexual risk behavior. So looking at things like discipline, whether rules are involved, maternal and paternal warmth, those types of situations in the family, and how those things affected sexual behavior, such as recency and frequency of sex in adolescents ages 10 to Well, I think it started at 9 to 18 years of age. So we looked at mediators such as that.
Gotcha. Okay, so using that as a segue, talk to us a little bit about what do you think what role does sex play in relationships, and particularly with Black couples? What does your experience say about that?
My experience say about
the role that sex plays in shaping Black male and female relationships?
Yeah, I mean, sex is a huge part of Black relationships, right? For example, I think that a lot of times we think about sex as just sex, but people are made for intimacy and people are made for relationship. So even the most introverted introvert can't be alone all the time, right? There has to be some type of human interaction. And that's backed up by research, right? Particularly like in the prison system, when you think about isolation in the prison system, mental trauma, mental health, those types of things happen when people are too isolated. So people are made for intimacy in some form or fashion. I mean, it doesn't have to be sex, but I think a lot of times, particularly in Black relationships, we look at sex as if it's intimacy. And it's
So there's a conflation of the two, where people
sometimes sex can be intimate, but it's not the only way you can be. You can only be intimate through sex.
Gotcha. Okay.
But in I believe in Black relationships, there's a disconnect there, particularly between what the woman believes is intimacy and what the male believes is intimacy, and what the female believes the sex means and what the male believes the sex means. Yeah.
Okay. So. Talk to me a little bit about that then.
Well, so, I mean, you think about this new generation, you never really know where the new generation doesn't always go by those normal gender roles, right? So things look a lot different, particularly like young girls, women these days are really celebrating their sexuality and they're really coming into their own. You got songs, about WAP, coming out, and there was a lot of pushback, particularly from men in the industry, saying that women shouldn't be talking about those things, right? But why not? It's a woman's body. She enjoys sex just as much as a man enjoys sex, and she should, right? Like, sex is not for male enjoyment.
Right.
Sex is for intimacy. It should be for both people, right? So I think with this younger generation, they don't have to be told to celebrate who they are sexually. Now, when I say that, it doesn't mean that people are out here being promiscuous and just having sex with whoever. However, women, not young girls, but like young ladies, are exploring their sexual prowess and their sexual beliefs and ideas and the sexuality that they hold physically. So, it's not to say anymore that men are out here, like just going from conquest to conquest. I think men want intimacy and don't know how to get that intimacy all the time. And I think it kind of takes them aback when a woman knows exactly what type of intimacy she wants.
Oh, like you're threatened by that in some ways or something?
Yeah, like, what does that mean? Like, what does that mean? It's like, and this is just, this isn't backed up by any research per se, but I think that there's like this balance that has to happen. Like, I don't think a man wants a woman who necessarily hasn't ever had sex, because then they have to teach things. And then I don't think men also don't necessarily want somebody who's had a whole bunch of partners, So, like, I think that's just something that, is a male type thing. They want newness, but they don't want everybody to have known.
Right. Yeah.
Right?
It's interesting, right? So, but I'm thinking about, so there are a couple of things that you talked on or that you mentioned that I want to go back to. And one is just this sort of idea of promiscuity and how that can be sort of troublesome or problematic in the context of these relationships. But I'm also interested in this idea of men sort of seeing women being sexually liberated and assertive as threatening. And I think that one of the things you mentioned is this idea that men, they want a woman who is experienced, but doesn't have experience.
Right.
Right. So yeah, so you want a woman who has a skill set that will suggest that she has experience, but with having had that experience,
right.
which is interesting in terms of the double standard. But the double standard is also consistent with the idea that the idea, sort of a broader sort of cultural or social sort of perspective that, as you mentioned, men sometimes believe that sex is exclusively for them and for their enjoyment and for their pleasure. And when they find themselves in situations where women's relationship with sex is similar to what we would stereotypically think of as a male's relationship with sex, they're turned off by that, or they're threatened by that, or they see that as, they get thrown off by that. And again, you were talking about the Cardi B and Meg situation when they came out with WAP. What was so interesting about that is I was looking at the internet, and none other than Jermaine Dupri and Snoop Dogg jumped out and were critical.
Right.
And I was like, wait, hold on. So this is the height of hypocrisy. Jermaine Dupri is widely known as the mayor of Atlanta, and it's because he's a one-man stimulus package in the Blue Flame, right? And Snoop, well, I mean, Snoop is Snoop, right? Yeah. And so again, I think that was just another example of the double standard that sometimes exists in the ways in which, again, to your point, I think men oftentimes see sex as a behavior and activity that is exclusively for their enjoyment, and other people are just sort of along for the ride, I guess, no pun intended.
Right. Yeah, and not all the time,
but too often. Yeah. So that is interesting. So the other thing I wanted to go back to was just this idea of sort of promiscuity, and how it is that, particularly with Black people, it seems as though there is a history of us trying to go about our business in ways that are sort of respectable and appear to be respectable to other people because of the ways in which our sexuality has been stereotyped.
Right.
And so I think that that is a part of what happens, and why it is that we find ourselves in situations where men could want something that is unrealistic, which is a woman who is experienced and skilled, but without having had any experience to develop those skills. What are your thoughts about sort of the broader socialization that men and women, boys and girls get? Because it sounds like you're saying that you're starting to see some changes and things are maybe a little bit different than in days gone by.
Yeah.
Did I hear you right there?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, definitely a generation.
Yeah, and so some maybe some evening out.
Yeah. Sort of.
To what do you attribute that? Whatever that change, how big or small, what do you attribute that to? What do you think is driving those changes?
Well, I mean, I definitely think the media, so even we were already talking about, Megan Thee Stallion and Cardi B and all those individuals. I mean, we had Lil' Kim and, so we had our own versions of those in our generation. So I think that what our kids see are Black women, embracing their sexuality.
Mm-hmm.
And there's still a level of fear there, because I remember just not too long ago, maybe a week or so ago, Cardi B was saying, when her daughter comes into the room, she turns the music off.
Oh yeah, Lil' Culture, I think is her daughter's name.
Yeah. So, she understands that although this is not a bad thing, sex is not a bad thing. We always try to tell young people that when we're doing our programs that sex isn't a bad thing. It's how you use sex that it can be a good or a bad thing, right? So, but even she recognizes that her daughter is too young at that age to begin that journey, right? So, but I think the media plays a huge part of that. I also think the relationships we've grown up with in our own home are a part of that too. So if you're not able to see Black love in a healthy way, what are you modeling? Right? So you're modeling what you see somewhere else if you're not seeing it at the house, right? So you might model it off television. Thankfully, there's not a whole bunch of videos the way it was when we were growing up, right?
Right. With what was it? BET had Uncut.
Yeah, all of them.
That was a mess. Yeah.
So was it Two Live Crew? Theirs was always real good.
Right.
So you see the way you see relationships in the culture, right? Like television shows that are on right now. Mixed-ish, Blackish, you're able to see like different relationships on television, and whether or not you relate to them or not is how you view them, right? We had Bill Cosby, we had Family Matters, we had A Different World that showed relationships. So I think the media plays a huge role in it, but I also think our families and peers play a huge role in that as well, because if you don't have that model at home, then you're going to your friends and talking about relationships, and then you're going to pick up what they lay out to you. So depending on what their view is and what they grew up with in their home or around them in their environment, they're going to lay that down to you and say, hey, this is how you should deal with that. It might not be right, but they're going to go off of their experience.
Right.
So I think a lot of it is just what people are exposed to. And the models that they have.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So let me ask you this, so I can pick up right where you left off. Ideally, what is it that people should be exposed to, or what do you think people should be exposed to? What should we be exposing people to?
Right. So, clearly the family structure has changed a great deal over, several generations, right? And I don't necessarily think that a two-parent home is the answer to this either. Now, if you can be in a two-parent home, a two-parent loving home where both people are engaged, great, engaged in a healthy way. But I don't think that's necessary. And so for my dissertation, I actually did not use, when I looked at paternal absence or paternal presence, I didn't use the traditional two-parent home. I used father figures. So that could have been a brother, it could have been an uncle, it could have been a dad, it could have been a stepdad. So do you have someone in your life that you trust, that you love, that you believe in, that you have a relationship with, right? So yeah, that modeling at home is all about healthy relationships. It doesn't have to be two parents who are married. Now, I think that that's an ideal situation if it's a healthy relationship and if they're both engaged in a healthy way.
Right.
We all know that just because you have two people in the house who are married doesn't mean that that's a healthy home.
Yeah. So it sounds like you're making a distinction between being present, right, and having a presence.
Yes.
And and although there's a lot of talk and a lot of fodder about, like you said, this sort of ideal family constellation around sort of marriage and co-residence, and if that is achievable, if that's doable, if that's in place, cool. But as long as the presence is there and not just simply being present, and so that's an important distinction for people to be able to make and understand, particularly as it relates to this socialization that you're talking about, in terms of how it is that people sort of begin to understand sex, the way that they begin to sort of think about the role that sex plays in relationships. And I think something else that you mentioned that was important, because you talked about a tool, and so in addition to the way that people see and understand sex, the way they think about sex, and the way that the role that they see that sex plays in relationships, I think it's really, really important that they get those ideas from people who have a strong, healthy, positive presence to use that language, in their lives, rather than simply attempting to sort of mimic or model what they may see in a home where people may be present or not present, but they look like demographically, right, what it is that folks may be holding up as ideal. But when you get into the nuance of the actual engagement, to use your word, in the household, it may or may not look the way that we would have it look. So I think those are important distinctions, particularly for Black people. When we see demographically, our families oftentimes don't look ideal.
Right.
And it's been the case that all too often people have used those demographics to try to paint us as deviant. But it may be that in addition to just plain old racism and oppression and discrimination, in addition to that, it may also be that many of those people weren't making those important distinctions that you just made for us between being present and having a presence. So I think that's good. I appreciate you sharing that. As we get close to wrapping up, one of the other things I wanted to ask you about is, what do you think? So even in this discussion around sort of like socialization around sex and what modeling a healthy relationship looks like, what do you think it is that people can learn from that, right? So we know that having a healthy relationship as a model is something that is important, and I don't think you would get any disagreement from anybody on that. But I want to go just a little bit deeper and ask, what is it that you think both researchers can learn from that, and also just sort of the general public, right? So again, as community engaged people, we're obviously interested in taking these conversations beyond the walls of a university or an academic journal and having a conversation and discussion with Joe and Jane public. And that's one of the reasons why we're doing what we're doing now, is to sort of broaden the conversation and have it on a regular sort of a mainstream sort of platform. And so when you think about the totality of our discussion today and these ideas about socialization and these ideas about sort of double standards, but what you see as sort of a changing of the times, and it sounds like a changing in a positive way in terms of some evening out, maybe not completely, but some evening out, and people sort of, especially women, doing a better job of owning their own sort of sexuality and the positive implications from that. What do you think, what are the takeaway messages is what I'm asking. What is it that people should
about Black relationships?
About Black relationships and the role that sex plays in them, against a backdrop of the changes that you see on the horizon?
Well, I think for researchers, researchers really need to understand why Black people get into relationships, first of all. Like, what are the reasons that people have identified as either assets into getting into a relationship? Why are they choosing to get into a relationship versus those people who choose not to get in a relationship?
Okay.
And when I say relationship, I mean a committed relationship. And then the other would be, what are those assets and even the barriers that are there in Black relationships?
Okay.
Because we can't even get to trying to figure it out until we figure out what like the etiology of these relationships really are. So I mean, I think that's a big part of it, as far as Black relationships, and looking at both males and females together, trying to figure out like, what is it about what's happening right now in America that allows women to feel free to be who they are. And for men, what is keeping you, or what is missing for you in today's world, in relation to intimacy, and like, what does that look like for you?
Right.
What does intimacy look like for you? And you did that, in a lot of your interviews. I think that's where you start, is, and that qualitative piece is extremely important. I think we do, as researchers, lean on quantitative a lot because, you know, you always hear that thing that, you know, numbers don't lie. Well, numbers actually do.
Mm-hmm.
Numbers.
So certainly the people who interpret numbers lie, right?
Right.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Who interpret the numbers, definitely so. You can spin a number any old kind of way, right? But when you can't really spin somebody's words,
Yeah.
you know, particularly on the backdrop of numbers. So I think doing more mixed methods research for researchers is extremely important in this particular area. For us regular folks, you know, like us, I think we need to learn to listen to each other, men and women, because, you know, we seem to at times both be speaking two totally different languages, but I think a lot of times we're saying the same thing.
Okay. We're
just saying it in a different way. Not all the time, but I think if we could listen to each other a little bit more, try to understand each other a little bit more. And I think that really came out in the study that we did together with non-custodial fathers.
Mm-hmm.
Listening to or hearing a non-custodial father's side of things. And for your other project, listening to the mother's side of things.
Sure.
Were different, but the same. You know, like they were really saying some of the same things. They really had some of the same goals, but they just couldn't get on the same page.
I'm with you. Yeah, the destination was the same, but they were taking different routes to get there.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So I think if you're if just regular people in the community, just being able to listen to your partner a little bit more, listening to and not taking it as an offense.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So I think that's, you know, when we hear when you're not, you know, you always, we immediately take it on as an offense. But in relationships, you have to be able to communicate. So just opening that door to healthy communication without the other person feeling like they're going to offend you. I think that creates a conversation for people to have. And I think if people can see people as individuals and just hear their stories a little bit more instead of immediately thinking, oh, well, she's good at that in bed, so she must have been with 50 million people. Or he's good in bed, so he's probably been with everybody and he's probably going to be with somebody after he leaves, you know, 5 days from now. I think instead of putting those stereotypes on each other just because we're men or just because we're women, you just kind of have to look at them as an individual. And if you want a relationship with the person, you got to get to know them.
There you go. There you go. I think that's a great segue into wrapping up. And so if I could put a bow on the conversation, for those of you all out there listening, if you don't take away anything else from this conversation, treat your partners as individuals, be open and willing to listen to them, and give them the grace that you would want for yourself. And I think those are three really, really key and critical points that you just touched on right at the end here that are really small and really practical, but they're difficult to do.
Yeah.
But if folks can put those into practice, I think that they'll be well on their way to establishing and maintaining the types of relationships that can serve as positive models, not only for themselves, but also for the generations behind them. So I think that brings the conversation full circle. Doc, I appreciate you taking the time to sit down with me, sharing your expertise and your insight into this particular topic, and giving the folks out there listening some really, really practical tools that they can put into their own repertoires to improve their not only communication, but more broadly their relationships as well. So we appreciate you taking the time. Thank you for coming out.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Absolutely.
You know, today we are overwhelmed by issues that cry out in civil unrest. As adults, we are so caught up in our own concerns that we don't even realize sometimes that children are aware. And you know what? We often don't even know how to explain what's taking place. We have a great children's book called Daddy, There's a Noise Outside. The story begins when the two children are awakened by noises in the middle of the night outside of their window in their inner city neighborhood. Daddy, There's a Noise Outside breaks down this complex issue of protesting into an easy conversational style that first graders and fourth graders can understand. Make sure you check out Daddy, There's a Noise Outside. You can find us on Amazon as well as our online store at www.fistoreonline.com. Pick up your copy of Daddy, There's a Noise Outside today.
What's more dangerous? A man who isn't afraid of death or one who's found everything to live for? I asked him if he was proud of me. He emphatically said yes as he laid his pecan-colored head on my chest, and I went through my mind 1,000 times to figure out what that could possibly mean, and every single example ended in motivation for me. So you may not be afraid to die, but I'm more afraid to let them down. And I found something to live for, which is a dangerous motive forever fueled. See, your thoughts may be involuntary, but my actions are very calculated. I was a man with a plan, but now I'm a dad with a decree, and you can't take that from me. My sons ain't raised by no coward, and they won't be one either. If this be the measure of a man, the yardstick gonna need way more meters. I take it too far, so they never come up short, because I found everything to live for.
Azalea, how are you?
I'm doing well. How you doing?
I can't complain. I'm glad that you were able to join us today. For those of you all listening at home, we have Azalea Israel, who I've known for a couple of years. We met, I'm trying to think, how did we meet? We met several years ago. I don't remember which year it was, but we met at the Black Family Conference at the University of Louisville. Do you remember this?
I do remember.
And if memory serves me right, you were giving a presentation on federally funded fatherhood programs, I think. And I was there giving a presentation about something. Anyway, so I remember seeing that in the program. I said, well, I got to go and see this. And went to your session, found out that you had spent some time at the University of Alabama, where I went to school. So I was like, okay, well, this has to be someone that I have a follow-up conversation with. And at the time you were working on a PhD at the University of Arkansas, right?
Yep.
And so you had a couple of SEC connections. And so when I'm not working, college football is a thing for me. So the Alabama connection and the SEC connection with Arkansas is like, okay, this is a must sort of follow up on. So again, I forget which year that was, but we developed a working relationship and a connection. From then on, you've since graduated, so congratulations.
Thank you.
And
Well,
right, yeah, but well earned. And since then, you've gone on to do some work out in Oklahoma, and also had to spend some time with Penn State. Is that right?
I did. I did my just finished up my postdoc last year with Penn State University, but I was located in Washington, D.C.
There you go. And I used to live in Northwest D.C., so that's another connection right there. So anyway, so when I was putting the book project together, I think I mentioned it to you early on in the process, and you were kind enough to make a contribution to one of the chapters. So wanted to reach out to you, have an opportunity to talk with you about the work that we were able to do. And so if you will, talk to us a little bit about your background. I know I've talked about how it is that we met and thrown in some things, but tell us in your own words, who are you and why is it that we should be listening to you? I know, but let the people know.
Absolutely. First, thank you so much for having me. Thank you so much for allowing me to be a part of this book, which I think is so amazing. It's going to make a huge impact. But I am Dr. Azalea Israel. I would consider myself a Black family scholar. So my background is in human development and family studies, which is an interdisciplinary field where we study every stage of life. So infancy, childhood, adolescence, young adulthood, and older age. And so we look at how things on an individual level and a familial level impact the behaviors of individuals. And then I earned my doctorate in public policy with an emphasis on family policy. And in that space, I look at how policies impact individual behavior. So I kind of look at it on both levels. We have how individuals kind of come together and create circumstances, but then also on the policy level, those things that are broader than our everyday lives, like how they impact our lives. So I think with those two lenses, I kind of bring that to the table in all the work that I do.
Yeah, absolutely. So I can certainly see how the family study side gets directly at the micro, but then the public policy side gets at the macro, and having, like you said, those multiple perspectives puts you in a unique position to be able to understand not only policy development, but policy implementation. And that's not something that is common in the field. As a person who used to be a practicing social worker, one of the things that was really, really frustrating to me was when I got the sense that policy had come down from administrators or sometimes elected officials, and you could tell that they were either never had any actual practical experience, or they were so far removed from it that they had no idea what was happening on the ground. And so they were just sort of pulling stuff out of various parts of their bodies that weren't at all connected or tethered to reality. So so again, knowing that you have both of those lenses and those perspectives, I think is really, really important. So thank you for sharing that. So the chapter that we worked on together dealt with the issue of trauma and the ways in which the men that were involved in the study were wrestling with various types of trauma, various forms of trauma, and the implications for their relationships. And so talk to me a little bit about your perspective on the role that trauma plays, and particularly these issues related to what we might know as what some would call sort of generational curses. What's your thought about how these things influence and impact families and maybe to a more specific degree, romantic relationships?
Absolutely. So that's a really hard question because there are so many different ways to go with it. But I'll just start by saying that it's incredibly important that we discuss trauma and, as you say, generational curses in both an academic space and in public discourse, because of what we just said. Trauma occurs both on an individual level, but then also on that policy and societal level. And I think sometimes people get stuck trying to decide whether, we should focus on the personal responsibility of individuals or, the broader spectrum of how different policies influence our behavior. And the answer to that, or the solution to that, is that we need to focus on both. Like, we don't have to pick, right? There are individual behaviors that contribute to trauma, and also policies that disrupt Black family formation, and then that produces trauma. So in academic spaces, policy scholars are seeking to kind of unpack trauma in various policy domains like child support, foster care, child welfare, in those spaces. And then I think in public discourse, there may or may not be a deeper understanding of some of those policies, but I think people, for the most part, are in tune with what's happening in their own families. So they would use the terminology like generational curses in speaking about their own families. So I just think it's really important that we have this both and perspective as we're talking about these things, so that we kind of cover both sides of it.
I see what you're saying. Okay. And so it seems to me that on the academic side, there's more of a sort of a discussion or conversation emerging or burgeoning around trauma and trauma-informed practice. And these are buzzwords that are in the field, and people are paying more attention to it. It seems as though less so in the public discourse space.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm thinking, and again, this could just be me in the circles that I run in, the people that I'm most familiar with, but particularly as it relates to Black people and Black families, it seems like some of what we know to be trauma or even generational curses, some of these things seem to be taboo in terms of whether or not we either do or don't discuss them within the family.
Mm-hmm.
Is it your sense that is that more pervasive than just in the circles I run in, or how do you think that sort of plays itself out?
No, so I have the same experience, and I think it's because, like you said, the word trauma is used in certain spaces. And so I have, let's say, family members or friends, maybe they don't use the word trauma, but they communicate it in a way where I can identify it as trauma. So I wanted to kind of share my perspective on how people, or men specifically, might communicate trauma. And I'll preface my comments by saying that I am a woman, as you can tell. And so I always approach my work in the manhood, fatherhood space as an advocate. Right. I don't really come to teach in a sense. I more so come to learn. And so I'm always kind of listening and in tune with how Black men communicate certain things. And I want to be able to use the skills I've developed in school to kind of bring that to a larger audience. But in terms of like how Black men communicate trauma, I think I have had like this new perspective in my life since I just got married in September. Thank you. So I can recall when I was courting my husband for marriage, he never used the word trauma, right? Like, as I'm talking to him and I'm trying to pull out all this information to see, if we're compatible, he would speak about things and I would in turn kind of conceptualize it for him. So for instance, he's the child of divorce. And he never said to me, when my parents got divorced, I experienced trauma and I was depressed, and he never spoke about it in that way. But I noticed that when we had conversations, whenever he would talk about his childhood, if it was like a really happy memory, it always happened before his parents got divorced. And then whenever he started to talk about depression or, loneliness or some of those negative traumatic experiences, it would always occur like later age, like after his parents got divorced. So I pretty much had to surmise, based on that the divorce of his parents was traumatic for him. But the thing is that he never, conceptualized it that way. He never said that to me, and I had to really pay attention to it. So that's something I'm learning more about in terms of, I think women will just say it, right? Like, this is the trauma, this is what I experienced. And I think men, it's a little bit different, which is why I appreciated being able to participate in this chapter, because it gave Black men the space to kind of talk about those traumatic experiences. And then you as a researcher and us as authors, we got to put that in a space where other people could hear about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And what's interesting about that is similarly as you were describing, when I was interviewing the men, I mean, they were just talking about their experiences, but they weren't sort of labeling it as traumatic, or they weren't using that language in terms of trauma or anything along the lines. It was only after the fact I was reading through transcripts and started to pick up on these themes. Right? Like, my goodness, like, wow, this is a whole thing for guys. And even as I think about my own experience, I don't know that, again, outside of doing what I do for a living, I don't know that I would necessarily describe some of my experiences again, I would now, right? Because this sort of language is in the lexicon, and this is the space that I find myself in. But sort of outside of what I do for a living, I don't know that I would. So this is really, really interesting. One, if I can, a quick follow up. You talked about in your experience, your now husband didn't necessarily describe his experiences in that way. Do you think it was because was he being willful and intentional about not doing it, or was it just not something that was on the radar?
No, I don't think he had the language for it, and I don't think he recognized it as trauma. Because in our community, you know, resiliency is the coveted characteristic. Like how much can you take and just move on from it? And men especially, we talk a lot about John Henryism, kind of this thought that Black men will work themselves to death and will not tell anybody when they're hurting or when they're in pain. And my husband is from the South, and I think that kind of perspective runs deep in the South specifically. But yeah, I don't think he had the language, and I don't think he knew how to say it in a way where it came off that way. I think he was very open and honest about his childhood, and then that allowed me to kind of ask follow-up questions, to kind of dig into it a little bit more. So I had to pull it out of him. And today, I'll mention that to him, and he'll get it. He'll say, you know what, that was traumatic for me, because that's the definition of trauma, when something breaches your life in a way where before it happened, your life was one way, and then after it happened, it was completely different. Like that trauma sits right in the middle of that. So yeah, I would shorten that up by saying he didn't really have the language for it, and maybe didn't have the space to have those conversations with other men or whoever.
Yeah, it's not something, again, at least in my experience, it's not something that is a regular routine, a part of what it is that men discuss. Again, unless other men have different types of circles that they're running in, it doesn't seem like that a lot of men have a lot of practice in discussing. Now, but you also drew a distinction between sort of stereotypically what men might do, or in this case might not do, or may not discuss. But you talked about how, as a woman, you seem to be sort of more versed and also even more comfortable having those types of discussions. Now, do you think that that's because you do what you do for a living? Or do you think that would be the case if you were, I don't know, like a seamstress, or if you were in some other field?
That's a good question. I will say that I did develop my voice as I, pursued higher education. And, you're in class and you'll hear about a theory, and they'll explain the theory, and you can kind of make these connections between your own life and how you behave now. So absolutely, I would say that as I got older, I started to want to unpack the experiences I had as a child. And started to kind of do some self-therapy, which I don't recommend. It's like the worst thing in the world to try to give yourself therapy. But yeah, I think that my experiences have definitely broadened my perspective. And now I ask questions about why I do things. I'm not just here and I came out of the womb this way. There are circumstances and experiences that I've had that have shaped me. And as I started to pursue higher education, I did start to ask those questions more.
Okay. Thank you for sharing that. So let me ask you this, as we sort of shift gears a little bit. I imagine that the people who are going to be viewing and watching this, they're going to be people who come from sort of academic spaces, and they're also going to be people who are folks from all other walks of life, where they may or may not be involved in sort of academic research, or in spaces where people are having these types of discussions, and so on and so forth. And so what is it that people need to know, right? I'm lucky, right? When I have an issue, like I can call you up and be like, hey, like this is what's going on. But like not everybody has that luxury, right? And so for those of folks who are out there in the world who may now be in a better position to recognize or acknowledge some things that may be happening either with them or the people that they are around, what is it that they should know? You talked about not doing self-therapy. What is it that you think people should be doing?
So along those lines, I am a big proponent for professional therapy, for sure. So, I mean, mental wellness is just as important as physical wellness. So I would encourage, trauma-informed therapy for I wouldn't say everybody has access to it, but I think that it is worth it to make the investment in that. Like I said, we'll go to we'll get a membership at the gym. We'll do all these things to kind of increase our physical viability. But when it comes to like our mental health and mental wellness, I do think we should seek out those professional resources more, because what tends to happen if you don't do the self-therapy, and in the context of romantic relationships, I think that people start to rely on their partner as a therapist. But in the sense of the Black community, all of us have experienced some level of trauma. And so we are not in the best position to kind of give that to our partners. And it's a lot for another person to handle. So maybe even couples therapy, marriage and family therapy, that is a field that takes into account the individual and also the role that they play in their relationship as well as in their families. I would encourage anyone who has access to that to do that. I think it would be incredibly helpful.
Okay, that's good. That's good. And it sounds like you're saying, again, not only professional help, but sort of resist the temptation to lean on your partner to play that role for you. Yeah,
I would say so. The other thing I want to mention is that, so I spoke about how women tend to be more in tune with their emotions and their experiences in that sense. But I also think that women can sometimes use therapy as a cop out to pursuing romantic relationships. So it's kind of like, oh, I'm working on myself. I'm, trying to figure this out, and then I'll engage in romantic relationships. I just want to put that in there because I have friends who have been saying that for years, right? That I'm working on myself. And therapy is not supposed to be a lifelong, in the sense of like moving towards different stages of life. Like it shouldn't take 10 years for you to get yourself together before you start to pursue marriage or pursue romantic relationships, in the sense of, moving on with life. So I want to preface my comments or kind of clarify that by saying there is a limit in which, we have the therapy, and then we kind of have to apply the principles and try to move on from it. Because I don't want to promote stagnation. And I think that's a big problem too.
right. So, okay. So there's a balance there. There's a fine line, right? It sounds like.
Absolutely.
So, okay. So wait, so you talked about women using, so this is some behind the scenes type stuff that you're telling us now. Women using therapy as a cop out, you're saying that becomes their reason or rationale for not exploring relationships? Tell me a little bit more about that.
It can be, yeah. And I'm speaking about my personal circle, but I don't think it would be too far-fetched to generalize it to other women who may be fearful of relationships. A lot of the women in my circle, it's grown since youth, but for the most part, the women that I grew up with, where we, transitioned from adolescence to adulthood, none of us grew up with our fathers. None of us saw healthy marriages, healthy relationships. And so when you go out into the world and there's potential for that, you may get into a relationship and it doesn't go as well as expected. And it's mainly because we don't have the tools to communicate with men, or at least I'll speak for myself. I didn't have my father in the household, and I feel like it essentially stagnated me in terms of how I could communicate with men, especially in a romantic setting, in terms of like living with the man. For instance, this is my husband is the first man that's ever been in the household with me, like, full time. And because I didn't have, I think that had I had a father, I would have understood how to navigate around having a man in the house. Men take up a different type of space than women do. I'll say that. And so all of these things are new to me. And I feel like had I had that father figure, father in the home with me, it would have been a lot different for me as I'm in this newlywed stage. But going back to the original question, absolutely. I think fear is a factor when it comes to women. There's a sense that all women, want to be married, but once it's kind of in your face and you have to execute and perform the duties of a wife, fear does become a factor because we didn't see it done. So now it's like, and we hear about imposter syndrome, right, in the academic space. I have imposter syndrome in my own house because I feel like I was not trained to be a wife. And so now I kind of have to figure it out as I go. So that's kind of where I was going with that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Now, for the folks at home, tell us a little bit more about this imposter syndrome so that we make sure we're picking up what you're putting down.
So imposter syndrome, it's a buzzword, I would say, in academic spaces, and especially amongst Black women who will obtain, degrees, get certifications, and all these other accolades. But when we get into a space with other men, other races, we don't feel like we belong there. We feel like an imposter, like we somehow cheated our way to that position. Even if, we did all the work to get there, there's still this sense that you don't belong. Mm-hmm. That's imposter syndrome kind of wrapped up.
Gotcha. And I would imagine that a lot of men, Black men as well, wrestle with some of those same issues. And then what's so interesting is you could find yourself in a place, in a space where you have a Black man and a Black woman wrestling with those same issues individually, and then trying to come together as a couple and form a union. I could imagine that would be really, really difficult, because all of the things that you were just talking about in terms of sort of like background, the way in which that sort of shapes and helps people prepare for their own relationships. If those things are not in place, then I would imagine that there's a lot of trepidation people are having about how it is that they're going to be able to navigate and make their way through whatever their relationships are. We saw a lot of that in the book, guys, talking about being apprehensive and nervous about the sort of the growth and evolution of their relationships, right? On one hand, they were excited about it, but on the other part, it's like, oh, what does this mean? I don't know. This is sort of uncharted territory, not only for me, but for many of the people in my circles. I don't have much of a foundation to lean on in terms of modeling or imitating or whatever the case may be. One other thing, just a quick follow-up. You talked about not having a dad in the house and how that had implications and so on and so forth. So do you think having had a dad in the house would have been enough, or would it take, in addition to dad being there physically, dad also having the sort of wherewithal to share with you and open up to you about these issues, sort of coaching you up? Because you talk about men taking up a different type of space. So I'm curious to know. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
No, I was gonna comment on what you just said about, making sure we understand the difference between like father presence and father engagement, right? Like you could have a father in the home who is not actively, because I've had classmates like that too, where I'll ask them, I've always had this envy, honestly, of my classmates who, my female classmates who did grow up with their fathers. And I kind of came with this assumption that because they had that, they were a different type of woman. But then when I would engage in conversations with them, they would talk about, my father was there, he paid the bills. But in terms of an emotional connection or him coaching me on how to pick a husband, those things were missing. And so I did start to understand and realize that there are different levels to that, like that father presence versus engagement. So you are definitely correct. I think fathers can have like a huge impact if they are purposeful and intentional and trying to help their daughters pick a husband. Because that's how they did in the old times, like we weren't just out here randomly picking people or getting advice from other women about how to pick a husband. I think that any woman who is pursuing wanting to be married needs that perspective from a man. There are just certain things that I don't think we can pick up on, by ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so you talked about being purposeful. So absent being socialized in that context, how do people make up for it?
Make up for like not having that presence of a father?
Yeah. So like, what is it that people do? Because again, I would imagine a lot of people who are listening to this right now saying, yeah, like that's exactly my situation. What should I be doing? Like, you can't jump into DeLorean, like, who's it, Michael J. Fox from Back to the Future, you know what I mean? And start things over. So for people who found themselves in that situation, and now that they know they can recognize when something is missing, what should those folks be doing?
So I will answer that question by saying what I did, and then hopefully people can kind of pick up on, what parts of that they might be able to use, because it is hard. It's pretty much like trial and error. So coincidentally, the one thing, or the first thing I think I did, was I entered into this fatherhood space. So I consider myself a fatherhood researcher, but as I said, I'm more of an advocate versus, being a teacher. And so I actually, in that deficit in my life, I started to look at professional men who had proven to be very credible and have a lot of integrity. So in researching, or in doing my research, I came into contact with a lot of fatherhood practitioners. So Black men working in a fatherhood space who were also fathers and husbands. You're actually one of them, if you didn't realize. So
I didn't know that. Wait, did you say professional and with integrity? And you got, okay.
Yes, I did.
All right, I'll take that. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
No.
That was a kind
and I'll call out some names. Kenneth Braswell, Fathers Incorporated,
yeah,
Patrick Patterson, Richard Barr. These are, if you're in the fatherhood space, you kind of recognize these names. And so sure. I think for me, having an image of a professional Black man who is a father and also a husband, and helping other fathers become fathers, right? That has helped me tremendously in terms of just identifying what I should be looking for, essentially, in terms of picking someone. So you guys didn't actually train me or coach me, but I watched you very closely in terms of how you engaged with your professional audience and with your family. So that was one thing for me. And actually being in the fatherhood space was very kind of therapeutic. Because when you don't grow up with a father, you have an unrealistic sense of the presence of fathers and the presence of men. So the further I went into my in higher education, the fewer Black men I came into contact with.
Right.
So I'm talking about in the classroom, not having really a lot of Black male classmates. I started to kind of look out, and I wanted to see, who can kind of give me the sense of what a father should be. And so I just kind of connected with who was in my space. So that's one solution, or the beginning of a solution. And then the second one is on a spiritual level. I have spiritual fathers. And that's what it says in the scriptures. There were fatherless children. And so in that sense, spiritual leaders became their fathers. And of course, I would encourage anybody to prove and to vet anybody who is kind of taking up that type of a space in your life. But that was my solution. I have spiritual fathers who introduced me to my now husband, actually, and was very involved throughout the process. While we were courting, I had very intentional questions for my husband before we were married, and I would kind of bounce those answers off of another male figure in my life just to make sure I was understanding it correctly. I didn't want to make that decision by myself. I wanted another for that.
This is fascinating. So again, I keep going back to the word intentional and purposeful, because it sounds like in every sort of realm, you indeed are purposeful, and certainly that would be advisable for folks who are listening. This has been quite an education, and I've certainly learned a lot. I would imagine that folks who are out there listening have learned a lot and picked up a lot as well. As we get ready to wrap up, is there anything that you think is important to share that I've not asked about or we've not talked about?
The only thing I would want to add is the formation of romantic relationships. Like, as you're getting to know a person that you may eventually become involved with, I think we have to be brave enough to ask the hard questions around trauma. You don't ask that when you first meet a person. Did you ever get hit as a child? Were you ever verbally abused? Like those, those are very personal questions, but I think that you have to be mindful that you have to ask those before you enter into a romantic relationship, and make sure that if the person did experience a certain level of trauma, that they are seeking help. Because eventually, it may fall on your shoulders to be that for that person. So I would encourage anyone who is courting for marriage or wants to be married, to purposefully, you know, position those questions so that you have that perspective and there are no surprises.
Yeah.
So that's the only thing I would say.
Absolutely. This has been fascinating. This has been awesome. This is exactly, I think, what it is that people need. So we appreciate you taking the time to sit down with us and share your experience and your expertise with us.
Thank you. I appreciate you for having me. Like I said, the book is amazing. I would encourage this to be a book club reading for people who are really interested in understanding the perspectives of Black men and their voices. And I'm so happy that you brought those voices to light in this book and allowed me to be a part of it. So thank you so much.
Well, I literally could not have done it without you, so I appreciate you as well. Folks, this is Azaliah Israel. We appreciate you taking the time to come out and check with us. Tell the folks where they can get a hold of you if they wanted to continue the conversation.
Sure. So I am on LinkedIn, Dr. Azaliah Israel. That would be probably the best point of contact. And I am really open to having these types of conversations. So I would welcome, you know, anyone who had questions or anything like that. I would be open to.
Awesome. Well, thank you again for taking the time. We'll catch up to you soon, okay?
All right. Bye.
I am the father of a 9-year-old little girl and a 6-year-old little boy, and I find fatherhood both relentlessly challenging and relentlessly rewarding. Both of our children came to us in amazing ways. My daughter is biological and my son is adopted. I love them both so much, from the morning when you wake up to putting them to bed at night, and every moment in between. It really is so special, and boy, is it exhausting. One thing that I fear about being a parent is the future for my children, because I think a parent's job is to protect our children, but also prepare them for the world so they become good, kind human beings. But I'm also hopeful that the future holds a more inclusive and compassionate world for them, and I know that they're going to make the world a better place.
Hello. Did you know that only 39% of all working dads believe they're doing a great job at being a father? Part of it has to do with how they feel about providing for their family. Well, today is a great day to take the first step into your dreams. We have a great program called Next Level Fatherhood. The curriculum is a 10-module course designed to develop practical and comprehensive fatherhood skills. In addition, we also provide support with child support, legitimation, expungement, co-parenting, and relationship skills. If you want to learn more about our Next Level Fatherhood services, visit www.fathersincorporated.com or call 770-804-9800. Thank you.
My mom and dad were traditional Asian parents. Now my father would go to work before I woke up in the morning, and then he would come home too tired to play with me. I tell my son, I love you every single day. I love you. Now my dad has never said that to me. Not because he doesn't love me, but because culturally it wasn't comfortable for him. So I teased him the other day and I said, how come you never say that to me? And he said, you're too old now. Now that he's a grandfather, he says, I love you to my son every time he sees him. My advice to all the fathers out there, forget the material things, forget the cultural restrictions. They grow up way too fast for you to waste even a single precious minute or moment.
Say bye-bye. Bye-bye.
you trying to figure out how to communicate difficult issues with today's children? Race, emotions, fear, and civic unrest could all be at the top of your list. Well, we have the perfect children's book that can help you with those challenging conversations. Daddy, There's a Noise Outside. Research shows that today's children receive and process information at much younger ages. In a complicated world, it's important to be mindful on how we express our fears and model our behavior. The Daddy, There's a Noise Outside read-along training video with Kenneth Braswell is an incredible tool for parents and teachers to talk to children ages 5 to 11. In this interactive video, your children can learn directly from the author about race and protest. For more information on how you can obtain usage of this training video for your children, class, or small group, visit www.gentlewarriorsacademy.com or call us at 770-804-9800.
Welcome, everyone. How are you all today?
Fantastic.
Doing great. Thank you.
Oh, I'm wonderful.
Awesome. Awesome. So we have the distinct pleasure of being joined by three men who have unique perspectives on these issues related to Black love and relationships. Specifically, we're joined by Keith Dent, Coach Michael Taylor, as well as Rod Joyner. Keith Dent is an author. He's a podcast host. He's also a relationship coach. Coach Michael Taylor also is an author. He's a motivational speaker, as well as a podcast host. And then we have Rod Joyner, who also has his own podcast. And so we're going to get right into the topic for the day. But that before we leave, I want to make sure that you have an opportunity to plug all of the work that you all are doing and talk to folks about how it is they can get a hold of you. But while I have you, again, we want to jump right into this. Given you all's experience, talk to me about what you see as the biggest challenges facing Black love and marriages.
Well, I'll jump right in.
Go for it.
I think the greatest challenge, especially from a Black male perspective, is we have what I'll call an antiquated paradigm of masculinity. For men, we have been conditioned that as men, we aren't supposed to feel, we aren't supposed to be connected to our emotions. And if we aren't willing to be emotional, we can't be relational. And so I think the real challenge is, especially as Black men, we have to be willing to challenge ourselves, challenge the perception that the media has put out about us not being emotional, and just be willing to connect with our authentic selves, who we really are inside. And so I think that's the challenge, challenging men to not be afraid to be emotional.
Not be afraid to be emotional. Okay.
Yeah, I'd like to kind of double down on that. I think with that, because we aren't attacking that paradigm, then we're not communicating with our partners. I see a lot of times where, especially when I'm working with couples, the wives or the ladies in the life will come and they'll be very adamant about what they feel the issues are, and it takes a lot, or it takes a while for the men to really talk about any of the issues that they're having. They'll easily be able to defend what their partners will say, but when it comes to their issues that they're having, they're a little reluctant to share. And I think it just goes back to the fact that they're not comfortable being vulnerable and telling their partners what their issues are.
That's big.
I guess I'll have triple down on that, because what both of those brothers just said is, when society has treated us as, well, you can't be emotional and vulnerable, because we tend upon looking on as weak, especially as Black men. So I think when it comes through is that, our counterparts, they ask for it, but when you do it, it becomes another situation. And I think as the coach said first, I think TV has translated out of this as well. What you see on TV, I guess that becomes what they say relationship goals. And that is not all true.
That's interesting. So if I can, just a quick follow-up. So you talked about the idea of men doing a better job of being open and being vulnerable, but something that you talked about, Keith, was this idea that in your experience, men are more willing to be defensive, what in the face of like an accusation, it sounds like you were saying, but not so much willing and open to sort of articulate their own issues. Tell me a little bit more about that.
Well, I think, and in the basis of my book, and I'll talk about that later, but I use sports metaphors a lot as a way to explain. And so I don't know if all of you played sports, but think about it. When, let's say, a play breaks down or something happens and maybe it's your fault, like the guy that got burned by the Green Bay Packers a couple of weeks ago with Tampa Bay. He'll have an explanation like, look, I was, someone else was supposed to be where they weren't supposed to be. We'll always have an explanation on why something is not working. And so that's what I kind of mean by defensive. We'll have a explanation of why maybe we're not as communicative or why this, why that, but we will have a hard time talking about our feelings and how we feel about how the relationship is going, or even if we have a problem with our partners. Because I think also on the flip side, we also know that our partners are very communicative and will have a response back. So we'd like, well, we'll just rather keep the peace, and as opposed to challenging our partners to try to get better.
I see.
For the good of the
Yeah, I can certainly see that. Coach, where do you think that comes from?
Well, so let's put it in context. You have to understand how the roles of manhood and masculinity are changing. And this isn't just for Black men. This is just masculinity as a whole. In our society, in our culture, in our country, for the first time, there are more women in the workforce than men. For the first time, there are more women graduating from college than men. So the roles of masculinity and manhood are changing rapidly. A lot of men aren't willing to change with those roles because, we buy into the old idea that you can't teach an old dog new tricks. The truth is, we don't have a choice. The roles have changed and men must be willing to change with those roles. The good news is men, I believe, are beginning to become more open. Why? Because once again, evolution. Men are being challenged to see themselves differently, and how we approach being men is changing. For example, it used to be that men thought that our three primary responsibilities were what I call the 3 Ps: procreate, provide, and protect. Unfortunately, society didn't teach us how to connect. And what men are longing for is connection. But you can't connect without your emotions. And men must be willing to embrace the idea that being in touch with their emotions and connection is what they really long for. And that's really difficult to get men to grasp because of the paradigm that we're currently in. But these types of conversations, that's why they're so important, because we have to expose men to some of these ideas. Now, obviously, there are going to be some men that reject it and have that tough, I don't want to be a wimp kind of attitude. But I can assure you, every man that's listening to this right now, deep down, we long for connection because that's just a human need.
This is good, and this is good early, right? Because I had so many follow-ups. So this idea of connection, is it your sense that, or in your experience, and this is for everyone, is it that men don't know that they want that or don't need it, or they don't have the tools and the ability to sort of manifest it, right? So I'm thinking about what you're just saying, Coach, and I'm also thinking about what you were saying, Keith, and I can envision sort of not to get too far into the weeds on this, but I can envision the sort of cover 2 defense where the corner is expecting the safety to help, and you see the bomb going over his head, and then before the ball hits the ground, the guy's saying, he's pointing to the safety like, where were you? Like, what's the deal? And so I can sort of see in my mind the unique ability of men to be able to point the finger and defend against sort of when something is going wrong, but being a little bit more challenged in terms of some of the other stuff. So that was a really, really good analogy. I want to come back to this piece around connection. is it you all sense that men don't know that they desire connection, or they just don't have the tools and the ability to sort of articulate that? Or is it some combination of the two?
I'll let the other men go first and I'll jump back in.
Okay.
I think it's just like you said, we just weren't taught how to, you know. It's like if you grew up in your grandparents' house and as I did, I watched my granddad go to work every day, come home on Friday and just hand my grandmother some money and walk in the room and leave back out. And she would, like, she's a cashier, would hand him something. He would go do whatever he had to do with his friends. So like he said, you know, with his 3 Ps, I think that part right there that we seen, but the communication aspect, I watched them talk, but their talking wasn't really like in depth of conversation. It's like, you paid the bills, you did what you had to do, you put the food on the table, I'ma run the house, you leave back out. And as he said, the evolution of women now is not the women standing in the house having 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 kids and working on one income. Now women are having one child and they're going back to be what CEO, CFO, whatever type job they have. And the role that we used to, the gender role that we seen from our elders is like, okay, you're making whatever, she's making whatever. So now you got to find this other way to connect with her. But we weren't built to connect with her because we're used to saying like, okay, I'm going to go make this money. I'm going to, you know, do these things for the house, and you just run the house. And now it's kind of totally different.
Yeah. And so, Rod, so I want to stick with you for just a second, because I think you're uniquely positioned, right? Because the audience that you engage on a day in, day out basis, I mean, college students, right? And
No,
so,
they're all graduates. They're all graduates.
Okay.
My demographics range from the age 28 to 60.
Okay.
They're all single.
Okay. So maybe I made some assumptions when I was hearing about singles, but it's all people who have either gone to college or are currently in college or have gone to college, it sounds like.
Basically all that went to HBCUs, correct?
Gotcha. And so you were talking about what sort of struck me as growing up being socialized by people who were, for lack of a better term, old school, right? And I can hear you sort of talking about your granddad, and I can almost see in his mind checking off the P for provider box, right? When he came home and gave your grandmother the check, and so then she gave him his cut, his little allowance, and he went and did whatever his thing was, whatever case may be. He made sure home was taken care of. But in his mind, home being taken care of meant that when I gave her that money, that was home being taken care of, right?
Yes.
So what I want to go to you on is in the conversation that you're having with the people who engage you on the singles network, are you seeing any sort of shift, particularly with the younger crew? Is it your sense that the guys are any more open to some of this stuff around wanting a connection or articulating that they have a need for connection than in days gone by? Are you seeing any shift there, or is it pretty much the same as it always has been in terms of the days gone by with your granddad and that generation?
It's equal, because you see the shift. It's basically, you see the shift, but when they talk, you want to hear old school, because we just had a conversation about this probably 2 weeks ago, that people believe, you know, down these day and age, that there shouldn't be 50-50 in the household. They still want that 100% where the man takes care of everything, but you do nothing. I mean, well, not do anything, but you don't bring anything else to the table. You still want to run the household, but on the side, stack your money. Whereas though back in the day with our grandparents and parents, where we had these companies, is like the plants, the docks and things like that, where you could actually send 3 or 4 children, you know, just working in a coal field or mining or working on a boat dock. My grandfather worked on a shipyard for 28 years. My grandma retired at 24. And, you know, she hasn't worked, or rest her soul, she hasn't worked in 50 years. So at the age of 24, he retired her. And I think the network I work for, they see that and they're like, well, why can't I have that? But as you know, as Coach said, and as Coach said, evolution happened. Everything evolves. You know, mortgages have went up, rents then went up. You know, everything that went up except for your pay. So now I need you to at least come in and say, okay, Miss So-and-so, I'm going to knock out this mortgage. I want to knock out this rent. I need you to deal with our electrical bills. I need you to deal with our little amenities, the small amenities. But they're not used to seeing that. So now it's like, I don't know how to adapt to this new role that I'm in.
Okay.
Let me jump in there. That's an interesting take, because I think that's a culturally thing, as all being maybe in most of the HBCUs are in the South, maybe a cultural thing. I mean, but I'm on the East Coast, and there's a completely different mindset when it comes to that, just based on income.
And Keith, just for the record, you're in New Jersey, right?
New Jersey, right?
Okay. So we have some regional sort of nuance here. So go ahead. I'm sorry.
So, in this region, you need both, almost both parents to work if you want to, afford some of the thing, your kids to go to college, have, extracurricular activities, and things like that. So, partners are looking for equal footing in regards to the relationship. And so things go awry when, let's say one partner's making more, especially the wife now, or the woman is making more than the husband. The husband there's some challenges around that, and where do I fit? Where am I gonna? Because you still have to do those things and still kind of be the man. And there's a weird dichotomy there, because we are, yes, as we were saying, for us, being the man is being the provider. So when we're not doing that, there's a kind of a sense of maybe loss of self-esteem, or just trying to figure out how to still maintain masculinity and not be the breadwinner. So I think those were some of the differences, that happen, regionally.
That's good.
Well, I'm not too far from you neither, Keith. I'm in Baltimore.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So let me ask you this, just to follow up on that real quick. What's your sense, Keith, about, and again, not only you, Keith, but for the entire panel, what's your sense about whether or not men are open and receptive to the idea that even in a situation or circumstance where they may not be checking off that provider box the way that in their mind they would ideally like to, do you see it as viable for them to play the role of the man, or whatever that means, by filling in with more of that connection? Or is it that they don't see that as being sort of viable enough, or warrants them sort of still being a man by supplementing whatever it is they aren't able to do from a financial standpoint with building a closer, tighter connection? Or is that sort of an apples and oranges conversation in the hearts and minds of men, at least in your experience?
Well, I think it's, and how do I approach couples? I think of it as the team environment.
Okay.
And so in a team, everyone has a role to play. Not everybody can be LeBron. You need a Chris Bosh, in your arsenal in order to make it work. And so I think and it's more about breaking down that mindset. And as far as, being comfortable that, okay, what is your role, also based on your personality too. That's also a big thing that we hadn't touched upon. You may not be that guy that is, pounding the pavement, all up in people's faces all the time. You may be a man that likes to talk and conversate. So use your strengths for the benefit of the family. If you try to be something that you're not, it's not necessarily going to work well, not just for your family, but also for you personally. So that's important, and to break down, what kind of man are you? And it's okay to be different.
So again, if we come back to the changing roles, as men, most of us, our identities are wrapped into being providers. And so for a lot of men, it's almost emasculating for to make more money than we do, because we think that's our role. That's the way it's been since the beginning of time. But as you look at, once again, the evolution, more and more men are becoming stay-at-home dads. And they're actually very comfortable in those roles. But again, there's a lot of men that in no way would be willing to do that, because they would feel emasculated, not knowing that men can actually be as nurturing as women.
Mm-hmm.
Our society has conditioned us to believe that women were always the nurturers. Men were the disciplinarians. But men have the capacity to be just as nurturing as women. Unfortunately, too many men struggle with their sense of identity because that's seen as being weak. So what we have to be willing to do as men is to shift, to recognize it doesn't make us less of a man if we make less money than our women. But we also have to be willing to contribute and make up for where the woman was doing all the houseworks. Men should be able to be comfortable saying, hey, baby, we're a partner, we're a team. I don't mind washing dishes. I don't mind washing clothes. I fold clothes. I have no problem with that. I don't feel emasculated by that. My wife makes twice as much money as I do. Does it bother me? No, because we're a team. We work together. We have finances together. We work as a team. And so there's no ego driven in me that says as a man, I'm supposed to do certain things. And that's a big shift for a lot of men.
It's a very big shift. And speaking of shift, let me shift gears and ask another question. What do you all see as the biggest strengths in the Black marriage and romantic relationship that you all come into contact with in your various lines of work?
Well, I'm a firm believer in emotional connection. And what I see occurring is more and more men are becoming open to the idea that the piece that has been missing for us is that emotional piece. Because I'll go back to my divorce. After my divorce, I really struggled with relationships. And there was this pattern that I saw after my divorce, that my relationship would last about 2 to 3 weeks. And the women were all saying the same thing as they left. I care too much about you to stay in this relationship because you're emotionally unavailable.
This is what they told you.
Oh, I see.
This is what they told me.
Okay.
They told me, I care too much about you to stay in this relationship because you're emotionally unavailable. And they would leave. Now, initially, I just got upset, said, hey, that's on you. I'm a good man. I can find another good woman. But I didn't really listen to what they were saying. But I had a friend, bless her heart, who said something that shifted my entire perception. And this is what she said. She said, Michael, because I was having a pity party with her. I was telling her, you women say you want a good man and yet you leave, all women leave. And so I had this story going on in my head. But my friend looked at me and she said, Michael, if one person calls you a jackass, you probably shouldn't worry about it. But if 2 or more do, you might want to get a saddle. She said, have you not noticed that you're the only common denominator in all of your relationships? So maybe it's not the women in your life. Maybe it's you. And when she said that, there was a part of me that really heard what she was saying. And in listening and allowing myself to receive that beautiful lesson, I realized that I was the problem. And I realized I needed to do some emotional work to move past that if I wanted to create a great relationship. And so I went on this amazing journey of transformation where I started off with therapy, getting in touch with some childhood trauma stuff that I didn't know was affecting my relationships, healed a lot of childhood scars. And then I was able to heal and then create the relationship of my dreams. I've been blissfully married for the past 19 years. And so I think as men, we have to be willing to take that journey, which is to connect emotionally.
And it sounds like you're saying from a strength perspective, it sounds like you're encouraged by the fact that it sounds like you're seeing more and more men being open and willing to do that. Did I hear you say that?
Absolutely. And that's what my work is all about.
Helping them do that, it sounds like.
Yes. And I would, jump in on that. And I think it took some courage to do that. A lot of times our men will go the other direction. And so if they get broken, they hear 1, 2, or 3 women that are, would leave them, and it would cause them just like, well, okay, I can't trust women because one, I was vulnerable with them, but then they still left anyway, and so therefore I'm not gonna get hurt. And so, and we're doing not only women disservice but ourselves, because like I said, we are, as Michael had said, we are emotional creatures, and social connection or relationship connection is the key to our relationships lasting and being strong, and not only for you and your partner, but also the community as well.
And I think like the biggest thing that you just said, Keith, was about, someone getting hurt. I think we look at it as like, I'm going to hurt you before you hurt me, to cover up any pain or whatever inside of us. And I think that's just how it goes sometimes.
Yeah. Any other thoughts on the strengths that you all see in relationships that you all come into contact with, or?
Well, again, my work encourages me a lot, because men are now becoming more and more open. When I started doing this back in 1995, I was attacked, criticized, vilified. I was accused of trying to be white because I was talking about emotions and healing and so forth. And now, some 25 years later, I mean, brothers are really saying, man, I want to learn more about this. I really want to learn how to connect. And so that part of me is so optimistic, because I believe in human evolution. I believe human beings are still evolving. And I believe as men, we're evolving. I think the roles of masculinity are evolving. And it's just a matter of us being willing to keep up with those changing roles.
Okay. So this is good. I actually have another question that you just sort of made me think about, which has to do with the specific piece around race here. You talked about when you were talking and working with people around emotions and relationships, you got accused of being white, as if to suggest that working on yourself and working on your relationship, working on your mental health, or whatever the case may be, or some combination of those things, that was specific and peculiar to white folk. What is that about? And is that something that both you, Keith, and Rod, that you all see in you all's work? What was it about people in their sort of version of being black would suggest to them that doing those types of things were the antithesis of being black?
The antithesis I used to see, growing up is like, oh, you need therapy. Nah, man, that's for white folks. Like, we don't do things like that. Us as African Americans, we normally just what it was said was we should just talk it out. But if me and you keep talking it and there's nothing changing, sometimes we need an arbitrator hit somewhere to tell me, I believe you're right. I mean, I believe you're wrong. You believe I'm wrong. Somebody got to step in and tell us, look, you're wrong. You're wrong. You're right. You're right. And how do we get this done? I just think how we always looked at it was like, as African American people, these are our problems. We're not putting it on nobody else. We got to deal with this situation in ourselves, and how we fix it, we got to fix it through each other, instead of going out and having a third party stepping in with us.
Yeah, this whole idea that what goes on in this house stays in this house, right? But
yes, that I did.
And we don't air our dirty laundry, but meanwhile the laundry is still dirty though, right? Like the laundry never gets clean.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think couples, and since I deal with couples a lot, they'll get to the point where they'd just rather go ahead and divorce. It's almost as if they don't think things will get better. And that mindset, or they've just dealt with it long enough where they kept asking, and then things didn't change, or it got to the point where it was too late. And where someone said, okay, now we can go for therapy. And it was, this ship had sailed by then. And so we just have to listen more and listen more sooner. And if we need to talk to someone, and I think one of the things which is different now is that with platforms that, like social media, now they have more access to people that look like us, that might be able to provide the support and also culturally know what the couples or even, singles might be going through. And that's a lot. It's a big thing.
But let me ask you this though, Keith. So when does it, like, if you deal with couples and I deal with singles, but I know some of the singles I spoke to, they say, I'm recollecting, or this situation happened before, and I'm not letting this go no further because the same situation that happened, I'd already seen this occurrence, basically saying I've seen this movie before. So have you ever dealt with like couples that say that same thing? Like, I've been through this before and I'm not trying to go through this again.
Well, yeah, I think you do get that from time to time where they have dealt with it, but there's you got to hear both sides. So it's either let's just say it's been a constant thing. Someone's got to really open up and figure out what the issues are. I mean, and as a coach, one of the things which is kind of different from therapy is that we have put no real skin in the game. If you do end up not working out, then that's, that's the choice on you. I'm not trying to bridge you either way. And I think that's, kind of talk, and I want to call it tough talk, but that talk is necessary for people to, hey, look, if you really want this, then you need to do the work in order to get it done.
But let's look at it culturally, though. Collectively, as Black folks, whenever we had issues, we generally, where do we go? We went to church. We were told to pray about it, right? Right. So we weren't told or taught to actually deal with and address emotional issues. Now, I'm 60 years old, and I can't remember a single time in my household that any grown-up ever asked me how I was feeling or why I was feeling the way I was feeling. Mm. I never had any adult simply share with me the importance of being able to express how I felt. Now, from 6 to 13, I experienced every type of trauma a child could imagine, you could imagine with a child, from abandonment, sexual abuse, rape, you name it. I experienced it as a child. And yet I never had anyone to talk to deal with the trauma that occurred because of those things. So it wasn't until after my divorce and I go to therapy that I start learning about the impact of trauma. And as a group, collectively, we as Black people, I believe, really need to have these conversations. We need to talk about the impact of trauma, the impact of abuse, because that's what's killing us. If we aren't willing to address the emotional aspects of who we are as human beings, we will never change. And all relationships, I believe, are based on those early childhood experiences that shape who we are.
Yeah, I agree totally. And that's one of the beauties why we're doing this podcast or right now, because
yes, absolutely,
this is a platform gives an opportunity for at least, men or couples to be introspective. Like, wow, there's some people out there we could reach out to and share our trauma, because we're saying that it's okay to talk about your trauma.
Yeah.
And we just need more people to be out there out front to say that it is okay.
And a lot of times, though, see, we talk about racial trauma, racism and discrimination and all of that, which is real. But at the same time, it is the emotional trauma within the context of our families that really shape who we are. And we got to be willing to talk about that.
Got to be willing to talk about that. And then the other part of it is with not only because to be willing to talk about it, but when we engage people in discussion or conversation around these things, when people that we know, love, and trust, when they put us on notice about some of the things that they see in us, it's important for us to not be defensive, right? Be willing to listen. And and I think, did I have this right? At the point in time when 2 or 3 people tell you you're a jackass, your next step, you got to get the saddle, right?
And get a saddle.
Yeah. You got to go get the saddle. Okay, yeah. So okay, I'm on it. You said a whole word there with the saddle analogy there. So we have about 10 minutes left, and what I want you all to do now is leave our listeners with some practical tips and some strategies and some advice. Like, what is it that people who are out there listening, what are some tangible things that they can do to put into their sort of relationship repertoires to improve their situations, or at least become a little bit more introspective to begin that process that we've talked so much about?
Well, one of my favorite sayings is, if you don't go within, you will always go without. Which means we have to be willing to become self-introspective. And self-introspection simply means we're willing to unpack some of the baggage that we're carrying around. We all have trauma. We all have stuff that we need to be willing to address. Now, from a male perspective, I believe the 3 most difficult words for any man to say is, I need help.
Hmm.
So we must be willing to remove the stigma that it's okay to say, I need help. Because as soon as we surrender to that and recognize that we can change, then our relationships change, our life will change. So the first thing I would recommend is, if you're dealing with some stuff, and we all deal with stuff, don't be afraid to say, I need help, and reach out for support, because there are lots of support systems out there.
That's what's up. What are you thinking, Rod?
I think the better communicate and stop ignoring the red flags. When you see the first red flag, please approach it, speak on it, talk about it, because what normally happens, and the line of work that I do dealing with my real job, is that I see these young mothers coming here and and they say, well, at one point in time I did, love them. I'm like, well, you saw the red flags from the beginning, so you should address these red flags before it comes down to something that neither one of you want to come into. I know childbirth is a beautiful thing in life, whether it's childbirth, abuse, mental, physically, death, jail. You need to address the red flags from the beginning to let yourself know, am I willing to deal with this? Is this person willing to change? Or do I need to just leave to figure it out? I think too many people see the glitz and glams of certain things. For prime example, we talked about last week on Amsterdam Talk, was that one of the ladies said, well, he had money. I said, well, if he had money, that doesn't, equal anything else. Your happiness is more than any, monetary figure that anybody can bring up. So, and that's why I was saying earlier, we relate to TV, and they see these things on TV like, oh, he can do this, he can cheat on me, he can disturb me mentally, but he has astronomical figures. He can take me to this place, he can do this for me, he can buy me this car, he can do this. And I'm like, no, at the end of the day, once all that goes away, because money doesn't last forever, once all of it goes away, now, as you said, Michael said, you are within yourself now, you're beat up inside, because your cure was a couple dead presidents that took the pain away for that moment. And my grandmother used to always say, you could drink all you want to, you're going to be fine for that situation. But when you wake up and you're sober the next day, them problems still going to be there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
that's
absolutely.
Real. That's real. Keith, what's on your mind?
Well, I think, as couples, you have to kind of address your needs, what your need, and first individually. And I try to have couples keep it to 3 to 5. And where couples will talk, per one person talks, the other listens. They have to prioritize what the needs are that they're going to work on, whether it be communication or openness or trust, and then work towards improving it. And then also having and I like to call it a family mission statement. And that's kind of I want to say a compass, or things values that you're going to have, that you're going to live by as a couple and as a family. And then it helps you. So if someone gets off course or goes awry, they have the opportunity to say, oh, address it, as opposed to just letting it linger. And, and then I think daily communication, with your partner. And it could be simple as just, talking about either, something that's happening in the news, or just like, oh, how are you feeling? And it just gives an opportunity. And that's where it's the ongoing connection, the emotional connection that's, as Michael said, is just necessary for our relationships to get stronger. And because I think in all, we want to do it, and we love our communities, we love our Black women, but we also want to be emotionally present as well. And so our relationships can grow.
Yeah.
But Armon, if I'll just say this, sure. Especially from a Black male perspective, I believe it's important that we make relationships top priority in our lives. Because, the first time I was married, I was on that societal roller coaster. I got married for all the wrong reasons, like climbing the corporate ladder, being responsible, but I didn't really understand the importance of intimacy and connection and all of those things. I didn't understand any of those things. I was 21 years old. So as men, I think we miss out on the most important part of life by not making our relationship top priority, because we're so focused externally. We're so focused on the mortgage, the cars, the house, all the stuff. But what's really important and what really will sustain us is connection. I really believe that. And again, as a result of 20 years of blissful marriage, it's the first priority in my life.
I appreciate this. We could do this all day, but unfortunately, we only have 45 minutes, and we've used 43 of them. So I appreciate you all taking the time to sit down with me to share. This has been an education. As an educator, this has been a full semester's worth of work, right? And so this is, I think, exactly what this time needed. I think this is exactly what the community needs. I think this is exactly what the culture needs. And so just a couple of quick things that really sort of jumped out at me, just this idea of being emotionally available, right? That's work that we have to do. And as a part of that, right, we have to become as adept at being emotionally available and vulnerable as we are at being defensive, right? We have to learn to understand and appreciate that we have a desire for connection. We have to put the tools in place in order to make those things work. Some of that is about just day in, day out conversation, giving the people in our circles permission to be whole human beings and talk about their feelings, because for many of us, we've never been given that opportunity. And so we may have been socialized to believe that there is no place or no role for that, particularly when it comes to us being men, particularly when it comes to us being Black men. I heard some work about the importance of identity, right? And recognizing who it is we are and what it is that sort of connects us or binds us to other people, because that's not something that we always do. So there are a number of nuggets here that you all dropped across the entire panel that I think people can sort of walk away with and put into their relationship repertoires to help them improve and enhance their situations. Before we go, again, I want to appreciate you all and tell you all thank you again for taking the time. Let folks know where they can get some more of these jewels from. How can folks reach out to you or connect with you on your various platforms? Go for it, Keith.
Well, great. Thank you. This was a fantastic panel, but you can find me. I have a Black Men Speak podcast. It's on. You can find it on any of the major platforms, or you can follow my Facebook Facebook page, Black Men Speak. And you can find me on Instagram at Keith_Dent. And my book, you could, if you are interested, you could just email me at info@keithdent.com. The book's called In the Paint, How to Win the Game of Love.
Awesome. Coach, you're up next.
Well, first of all, let me acknowledge you for having this conversation. This is so very important in our community. So I want to acknowledge you and Rod and Keith for joining in, because this is the true work I think that we have to do as a people. I don't think there's anything more important. With that being said, you can find most of my work at shatteringBlackMaleStereotypes.com. And from there, you can find my podcast. Got several books, coaching programs, online courses, a wide variety of personal development programs designed specifically for Black men. So if you've been considering getting a coach or doing some personal development work, it's a great resource for any Black man that's really ready to step up and to become who they were born to be. So on the social media channels, you can find me at Coach Michael Taylor on most platforms.
Awesome. Rod, you get the last word for the day.
You can find us at HBCU Singles on YouTube, so you can check any of the content out, same as on the podcast, on any genre. You can also come to the Facebook group, HBCU Singles Lounge. Also, we just started a HBCU's Couples Lounge to spin off. We found out some people were getting in relationships, so we put them into basically break them up. And also, you can email us at info@HBCU Singles Lounge.
Awesome. Appreciate you. So again, I thank you all for taking the time to sit down with me. I appreciate you all dropping this knowledge on me and all of the listeners. I appreciate you all sharing your platforms with me. I saw it only right to do the same. This has been worth its weight in gold, and I think that all the people out there listening are going to gain a lot from it. So again, my sincerest appreciation and thanks. Hope you all have a good rest of the day, and we'll catch up to you all soon, okay?
I love you.
All right, folks, so there you have it. We've had a full day, a lot of good information. We had an opportunity to hear from a whole range of expert researchers as well as practitioners who are active in the field working on the front lines with Black men and couples, helping them to work through whatever issues they may have, leveraging their strengths to improve and enhance their relationships. And so I want to thank you for taking the time to share with us and to visit with us and to give us your attention on these topics that we feel like are really, really important for the vitality of our families and most importantly, our community. Before I let you go, I want to take a couple of minutes just to recap to make sure that you leave with a couple of tangible pieces, not only from each of the presenters, but also with sort of a large sort of big picture perspective on some of the key takeaways. So we'll do this and then we will wrap up for the day. First, a couple of highlights from Dr. Smith. Remember, she talked with us about the idea that media shapes our perceptions, particularly as it relates to Black love. And we need to be mindful of that because these things we tend to internalize in terms of the messages that we receive and that we consume. And so paying closer attention to what it is that we are watching and receiving, because again, although many of these things are for entertainment purposes only, they have larger and broader impacts and effects on our sort of thinking and perceptions as it relates to how it is we see ourselves and we see our partners and our potential partners. She talked to us about the idea that media portrayals of Black couples have historically mostly been negative. And when they haven't been negative, then we've been sort of boxed or framed in this state of non-recognition. And to whatever extent there are media portrayals of Black love and Black relationships, they mostly center on how it is that men and women can sort of trick each other or coerce each other or run game on one another, rather than simply sitting down, working together to get through or get past whatever issues they may have and actually having their relationships thrive and excel rather than just sort of struggle and respond to strife and strain. The other thing that she mentioned to us that I think is important is this idea of media literacy and the way in which it can help us to better read, interpret, and comprehend the messages that we're receiving. So being more critical in terms of how it is we receive media and how it is that we interpret media with again, a more critical eye, making sure that to whatever extent we can, we're cognizant of the types of messages that we're receiving when it is that we consume whatever it is that we consume. Dr. Cherie Langley, she came in and she talked with us about the role that sex plays in relationships. And she mentioned to us that, again, although sex and intimacy are closely related, largely because they're both human needs, that the two are not the same and shouldn't be confused, right? So obviously sex is an intimate behavior, but sometimes we run the risk of thinking that sex is intimacy, and that's not exactly true, right? Sex is a part of intimacy, but there can be intimacy beyond sexual intercourse or sexual behavior. So again, so she was able to help us make some distinctions. There's some important distinctions because for many of us, we walk around thinking the two can be used interchangeably, and that's not the case, as she was able to explain to us. She talked to us about the idea that men want intimacy, but sometimes don't know how to get it. And so it's important for us to, in our relationships, to ask important questions about what it is that intimacy means to men, right? How is it they define intimacy? What does intimacy look like for them? I think that's important for a couple of reasons. One, it can help men to better articulate what intimacy means to them. And if nothing else, it helps to put them on notice about the distinctions between things like sex and sexual intercourse versus intimacy, and how, again, the two are related but aren't necessarily the exact same thing. Something else that Dr. Langley talked to us about was the idea that in the contemporary society, what we're seeing is that women tend to be a little bit more sexually expressive and assertive than in the past. And sometimes this feels threatening to men because of the negative stereotypes about liberated women. So again, so if we think about what it is that many of us have been told about how it is that men are creatures who desire or strive for sex, and how it is that women are creatures who are supposed to withhold sex. If we've internalized those messages, which are largely erroneous and sort of rigidly gendered, then we run the risk of making some erroneous assumptions about what it means when women are sexually expressive and assertive, and how that can be threatening to some men if they don't have sort of a frame of reference to understand how that is or how that can be the case. And so she gave us some specific examples of women in popular culture who've been criticized for sort of owning their sexuality and the double standard that exists there. So again, something else for us to be cognizant of and paying attention to, so that we can resist the temptation to fall into those traps, doing the same thing in terms of perpetuating negative stereotypes. And then lastly here, another important point that I think Dr. Langley dropped on us was the idea that healthy relationships are things that should be modeled, and we all need models for healthy relationships, but they don't always come packaged as these sort of demographic ideals. Remember, she talked to us about the idea that although many of us value and hold up as optimal the sort of married two-parent resident household, and although there is research to support the idea that those types of family arrangements are and have been associated with positive outcomes for children, the thing that Dr. Langley pointed out to, and I think is really important for us, is to remember that the healthy relationship, underscore the word healthy, is what drives those outcomes. And it is indeed the case that you can get similar outcomes even if you don't have that sort of demographic arrangement, as long as the relationships are healthy and as long as the level of engagement is there on both parties, whether that be mothers and fathers or whatever the case may be. And again, she also, remember, she talked to us about the difference between simply being present in the home, right, and having a presence, which has much more to do with the quality of the involvement and the level of engagement. So again, I think those are some really, really important points that she dropped on us in that discussion. Dr. Israel came in and she talked with us about the issue of trauma and the way in which it influences and impacts relationships. To be specific, she mentioned that people experience trauma at both the individual level as well as at the policy and the institutional level. So in other words, people will perpetuate traumas against one another, right? But it's also the case that people can be traumatized by the negative influence and impact of policy or their interactions with institutions or systems. And certainly this is the case for Black people, at least here in the United States. I can't think of any institutional system that has not had a traumatic impact or influence on the lived experiences of Black people. And public policy has not been our friend as well. And so we have to think about those things and broaden out our thinking as it relates to trauma and the way in which it influences us individually, but more specifically how the individual influences spill over into our romantic relationships. She mentioned to us that talking about trauma can be difficult, not only because for many of us in our communities and our families of origin, these things are taboo, but it's also, and it can also be difficult because we don't always recognize when we've been traumatized or when we've had trauma. And even if we do recognize it, which is again, not always the case, it may be that for some of us, we don't have the language to be able to articulate that. She talked about how difficult it is for some of us, not only to recognize when we've been traumatized, having had previous traumas, but even more difficult for us to be able to muster up the language to be able to articulate that, right? So she talked to us about the importance of, again, asking specific types of questions so as to prompt our partners to talk about what it is they've been through so that we can help not poke and prod them, but have some authentic discussion and conversations, particularly in the courtship and dating phases of our relationships. Because again, she talked to us about the reality that if we don't get these things out into the open and deal with them, address them in a positive and healthy way, we end up bearing the brunt or the burden, right, quite frankly, of having to deal with other people's baggage if they've not dealt with it and moved beyond it or been able to overcome it themselves. And so all of that was under sort of a larger umbrella of prioritizing and the importance of us prioritizing our mental health, just like we do our physical health, right? And I think that's a really, really key and important point that Dr. Israel brought to us. Some of the highlights from our panel discussion with our life coaches, relationship coaches, and other people in the media who engage Black couples, particularly Black singles, and so on and so forth. We learned that men are looking for connection, but even in looking for that connection, in order for us to be relational, right, which is necessary in terms of being able to build and establish those connections, in order for us to be relational, we have to be emotional. And although we want to sometimes be relational, the emotional part sometimes can be troublesome or problematic, largely because of the way that many of us have been socialized, right? Men don't typically get socialized with the thought and idea that they can be emotional. And if they have those thoughts, they go back to that word model, they oftentimes don't have models for how it is to do that and do that in a healthy way, right? Stereotypically, men learn that they can express themselves sort of from a physical standpoint. They learn to be aggressive, which is all something under the umbrella of what we call externalizing behaviors. But men don't always get good modeling about how it is that they can discuss and have a conversation around what it is that they feel and need from an emotional standpoint. So that can be a sticking point for some men. And the panel was able to sort of talk to us about what their experiences have been and the people that they come into contact with around those issues. They also talked to us about the idea that men are sometimes more comfortable being defensive, right, rather than simply being defensive and explaining away whatever issues they may be wrestling with, rather than being transparent with us about what their emotional needs are. And again, I think that sort of piggybacks on the first point about not having a lot of experience or practice or role models around how it is that they can emote or be emotionally demonstrative in terms of expressing whatever their needs are. But men tend to have more experience and being more comfortable with being defensive and explaining away and maybe even scapegoating, right? And in the face of whatever their issues or challenges may be. The panel also talked to us about the idea that for a lot of Black people, this is both men and women. Again, we go back to that word socialization, which has to do with upbringing and things of that nature, family of origin, that many of us have not been socialized or given permission to express how they feel. And in conjunction with that, have also not been given a lot of opportunity to think about or talk about how it is they address emotional issues. And as a consequence of that, what many of us end up doing is we just simply absorb and internalizing our trauma. We just sort of deal with it. You hear a lot of people talking about resilience and strength. And I mean, obviously these are positive attributes that many of us have, but we ought not confuse strength and resilience with just simply being dumping grounds for our own trauma and even other people's trauma without having positive outlets for those things. And so, unfortunately, that's what happens with a lot of us, right? Because we feel compelled to present as strong or present as resilience, we just, again, absorb and internalize over and over again. And that has a cumulative effect in terms of our own mental health, but even beyond our own individual mental health, but the way in which those issues tend to play themselves out in the context of our romantic relationships. The panel also talked to us about the importance of not ignoring red flags, leaning on our core values, allowing them to sort of guide our decision making, and also removing the stigma related to asking for help, right? Again, this is something that a lot of men struggle with, right? Asking for help because of the concern or because of the perception that that is some sort of an indication of weakness. But the honest truth is, the ability and the willingness to ask for help is really more of an indication or a sign of courage, right? Because it's not something that all of us have the wherewithal to, number one, recognize and acknowledge when we need help, but then two, being strong enough to say, hey, I don't have it. I don't have all of the answers here. So I'm reaching out for some assistance and for someone to sort of help me move through this or get beyond whatever it is I may be facing. And then the last bullet point here is, we should all be encouraged by what the guys on the panel said, because they talked about how in their work, what they're seeing is this trend where men are more and more open to recognizing that the missing piece in their relationships is emotional connection, right? And so, again, it gets back to this point that not only the panel made, but several of our interview experts made, which is relationships and being relational and wanting intimacy. These are things that are just human. And are common to the human experience. And so we should all be encouraged by the fact that we see men being more open to these ideas around relationships and expressing a desire for companionship and intimacy. And so if we can get to the point where more men are prioritizing their relationships, then I think we're in a really, really good place to be able to leverage the strengths that we have so as to help us get beyond whatever challenges our relationships may be facing. So again, these are things to be encouraged by, and we want to leave on a high note. Just some last key takeaways that I think were brought up in several of either the panels or the interviews, but there were some things that came up over and over again that I want to make sure people walk away with a clear understanding on. One is that you heard several times that men and fathers play a key role in helping young people to understand the impact of media, socializing young folks about gender roles, as well as modeling healthy relationships. And so again, for those of us interested in fatherhood and masculinity, we see, again, men playing a key role in helping move the community, moving the culture forward in a positive way by taking additional responsibility, not only for themselves, but also for making sure that the next generation and those around them, whether they be their own children or whether they be serving as social fathers or father figures to other people who may not be biologically their children, working with those folks and having discussion and conversation with them about these types of issues to make sure that people have a firm foundation as they get to a point where they're entering into their own relationships. We heard over and over again across a couple of different contexts that being present is not the same as having a presence, right? So it's not enough to simply be around, but one has to be engaged and one has to be involved. And a lot of that engagement involvement has to do with doing some of the emotional work that's difficult for many of us. So historically has been difficult for a lot of men. So again, being present is not the same as having a presence, right? That was something that came out several times and I think is really, really important for us to underscore. Next is that, again, there's a lot of work that needs to happen in order for us to reverse the impact of negative stereotypes, some of these patterns of emotional suppression that have been superimposed on our communities by sort of broader forces, as well as a lot of work to be done to reverse the negative impact of rigid definitions of masculinity and femininity, right? So many of us have been taught and been trained and been socialized to believe that there is a single way to be a man and there is a single way to be a woman. But what we're learning is that in a newer sort of contemporary context, we're seeing a blurring of those lines. And for many of us, we see that as a positive thing because we don't attempt to box people into these sort of scripts around what it is that men do and what women do without any sort of overlap. And so what we can be encouraged by there is that there is a freeing and there is a sort of an allowance for people to be more their authentic selves, and recognizing that there is diversity and there's versatility in how it is that we go about our business in terms of gender identity and expression and things of that nature, and that we can value people who are engaged in roles that may be non-traditional for many of us, but again, still seeing value in that. And I think that's a positive thing. And then the last thing is the word intentional and purposeful came up several times. And so it's important for us in the context of our relationships to be intentional about creating safe environments for our partners. Then once those environments are established, asking important questions. And then this is a big one, listening, right? And listening without being defensive. And so I say that one again, being intentional, which means don't just wait for it to serendipitously or haphazardly happen on its own, but be thoughtful, be purposeful, be intentional about creating a safe environment for your partner, asking important questions, and then listening without being defensive. I think if we can do some of those things, we're well on our way to having more of the types of positive, healthy relationships in our communities that many of us want to see, many of us strive for, and many of us already know exist, but we are looking to sort of multiply those so that other people have an opportunity to learn from and grow from the models that have been set for them in the communities and the circles of influence that they may be around. I am really, really appreciative of you taking the time to sit down and listen to not only me, but all of our presenters. I think these, again, are important discussions and conversations that have significant implications for the health and the futures of our families and our communities and of our culture. I hope you will take some of these messages and internalize them and put them into your relationship repertoires so that you can do your part to help move the culture forward. I am Armon Perry. This has been Black Love Matters, and we thank you for coming out.